Fiona Lennox was 3 seconds from throwing a teapot at the wall when she heard the knock. Not a polite knock, not a timid guest at a bed and breakfast knock. This was the kind of knock that said somebody on the other side of the door had been standing there a while, working up the nerve, and had finally committed to the act, with more force than necessary. It rattled the kitchen window. It startled the cat off the counter. It made Fiona drop the teapot she had been about to hurl at the cracked plaster above the stove, which, in hindsight, saved her from having to explain shattered porcelain to her 7-year-old daughter. She wiped her hands on her jeans, stepped over the pile of unpaid invoices she had swept off the table in her earlier fit of frustration, and walked through the narrow hallway toward the front door of Briarstone House. The hallway smelled like damp wood and old lavender sachets that had given up their scent about 2 years ago, but still hung from the coat hooks out of habit. The floorboards groaned under her feet. Everything in this house groaned. The pipes groaned. The stairs groaned. The roof groaned when the wind came from the north, which in the Scottish Highlands was roughly 300 days out of every year. She opened the door. The man standing on her front step looked like he had been assembled from spare parts of 2 completely different people. His boots were expensive. She could tell because the leather was the kind that got softer with age instead of cracking, the kind that cost more than her monthly electricity bill. But the rest of him was a wreck. His jacket was mud-streaked. His dark hair was pushed back like he had been running his fingers through it all morning. He had the face of someone who had recently been handsome and was currently too tired to bother with it. Cheekbones sharp under skin that looked like it had not seen proper sunlight in months. His eyes were gray, not the romantic, stormy kind, the flat, drained kind, the kind that made Fiona think of an appliance that had been unplugged. He was holding a newspaper, the classified section. He had circled her ad in blue ink. "You need a gardener," he said. It was not a question. His accent was English, not just English. The kind of English that came with trust funds and country houses, and the ability to say words like, "actually," in 4 syllables. Fiona leaned against the doorframe. "I need a lot of things. A gardener is about 9th on the list, right after a new roof and a time machine." He did not smile. He looked at the garden behind him, and she followed his gaze. The garden was a disaster, not charmingly overgrown, not romantically wild. It was the kind of garden that made estate agents wince and guests leave 1-star reviews with phrases like, "grounds could use attention," and "not as pictured." The stone wall that had once bordered the property had collapsed in 3 places. The rose bushes were staging a hostile takeover of the front path. The lawn, if you could still call it that, was more moss than grass, more mud than moss. "Can you fix the stone wall?" Fiona asked. He turned back to her, studied the wall. "I can try." That is not exactly a ringing endorsement. I do not make promises about things I have not done yet. Fiona waited for him to say something else, to offer references, a phone number, a last name. He offered none of these. He stood there on her front step with his expensive boots and his wrecked face, and his circled newspaper ad, and waited for her to make a decision. 7-year-old Mary appeared at Fiona's hip, one hand gripping her mother's belt loop, the other holding a half-eaten biscuit. She looked up at the man with the ruthless appraisal that only children and cats are capable of. "Are you the gardener?" Mary asked. "I might be," the man said, and for the first time, something moved behind his eyes. Not quite warmth, not quite a smile. Something closer to surprise, as if he had not expected to be addressed by a small person, and was recalibrating. "What is your name?" Mary asked. "Edward." "Edward what?" He paused. It was a fraction of a second too long. Fiona noticed. She filed it away in the part of her brain that catalogued guest behavior, the part that had learned to read people by the way they held their luggage and whether they made eye contact when they complained. "Edward Ashworth," he said. "Fine," Fiona said. £12 an hour, cash. I cannot afford more than that. The cottage out back has a bed, a stove, and hot water most of the time. You can use it if you need somewhere to stay. I will not ask questions if you do not give me reasons to ask them." He nodded once, picked up a bag she had not noticed, sitting beside the step. It was a leather duffel, also expensive, also beaten to ruin. Fiona stepped aside to let him through, then caught herself. The cottage is around the back, through the garden, or what is left of it. He turned and walked toward the side of the house without another word. Mary watched him go, still chewing her biscuit. "He is sad," she said. "He is a stranger," Fiona corrected. "We do not diagnose strangers." But Mary was right. Fiona had known it the moment she opened the door. The man was carrying something heavier than that duffel bag, and whatever it was, it had hollowed him out from the inside like a gourd. She closed the door, went back to the kitchen, picked up the teapot she had almost thrown, set it gently on the counter, looked at the invoices on the floor, looked at the crack in the plaster above the stove, looked at the window, through which she could see Edward Ashworth walking through her ruined garden toward the cottage, his shoulders set like a man walking into weather. "Well," she said to the empty kitchen, "that is either going to be the best decision I have made all year, or the beginning of a true crime documentary." The cat jumped back onto the counter and knocked over the sugar bowl. Fiona cleaned it up. She cleaned everything up. That was what she did. Edward Ashworth, 6th Duke of Lindmore, stood inside the cottage behind Briarstone House and tried to remember the last time he had been in a room this small. It had one window, one bed, iron-framed, with a mattress that sagged in the middle like a hammock, a wooden table, a chair, a stove with 2 burners, and a kettle that had seen better decades. The walls were stone, whitewashed but yellowing, and the floor was bare concrete, covered by a rug that was more thread than fabric. He set his bag on the bed, sat in the chair, listened to nothing. 6 months ago, he had been in a 4-poster bed in the master suite of Lindmore Hall, Northumberland, listening to a machine breathe for his wife. Catherine had been 31. She had been diagnosed 14 months before that. She had fought with the kind of quiet, organized fury that was entirely her character, the same way she had organized charity galas and dinner parties and the renovation of the East Wing. She had fought cancer the way she did everything else, with lists and schedules and a refusal to inconvenience anyone with her dying. He had held her hand at the end. It was cold. He remembered being surprised by that, which was foolish, because of course it was cold. But he had expected, somehow, that love would keep a hand warm. It did not. Love did not keep anything. After the funeral, the house had filled with people. Relatives, staff, friends of friends, people who sent flowers and cards and casseroles, and used the word journey, as if Catherine had gone on holiday instead of into the ground. Edward had endured 3 weeks of it. Then one morning, without telling anyone, he had gotten into his car and driven north. He drove for 9 hours. He stopped in a village called Craigmore because the petrol light came on. He walked into a pub called the Stag, and sat at the bar and drank a whiskey. And when the bartender asked if he was passing through, Edward said no. The bartender looked at him for a long moment, and then pointed at a board near the door, where locals pinned adverts and notices. A small card, handwritten in blue ink. Gardener needed. Briarstone House. Must be willing to try. Must be willing to try. He had almost laughed. He had almost cried. He could no longer tell the difference. He had driven to Briarstone House the next morning, and now here he was, sitting in a cottage that smelled like cold stone and old tea, with nothing but a bag of clothes and a wallet full of cards he would not use, because the moment he used them, the name Lindmore would follow him here, and whatever thin, fragile quiet he had found would shatter like the teapot that woman had almost thrown. He had seen the teapot. He had seen the invoices on the floor. He had seen the crack in the plaster and the state of the garden and the way her daughter gripped her belt loop, and he had understood, instantly and completely, that Fiona Lennox was a woman holding a collapsing building together through sheer stubbornness, and that she would keep holding it until her arms gave out or the building buried her, whichever came first. He knew the type. Catherine had been that type. The only difference was that Catherine had had money. Edward unpacked his bag, 2 shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, a jumper, a photograph in a wooden frame, which he set face down on the table without looking at it, a pair of gardening gloves he had bought at a petrol station somewhere in the Lake District, a notebook, a pen. He did not have a phone. He had left it in the glove box of his car, which was parked at the pub. He did not want to be reachable. He did not want his solicitor calling to discuss the estate. He did not want his mother calling to discuss his mental state. He did not want anyone calling to discuss anything. He wanted to fix a stone wall. That was the full extent of his ambition. He went outside. The air was cold and smelled of peat and wet grass. The garden stretched behind the bed and breakfast in a rough rectangle bordered by the remains of a dry stone wall, beyond which the land sloped upward into open moorland. The roses were everywhere, not carefully tended climbing roses, feral things, thorned and tangled, sprawling over the path and up the side of the house, and into the remains of what had once been a vegetable patch. The lawn was a swamp. The compost heap in the far corner was 3 years past the point of being useful, and had become a small, rotting monument to good intentions abandoned. Edward walked the perimeter. He touched the stones of the collapsed wall sections. Some were cracked, some were just displaced, shifted by frost heave and gravity and neglect. He could rebuild this. He knew dry stone walling. His grandfather had taught him on the estate walls at Lynmore when he was 12, back when being a duke was something that happened to old men in portraits, not something that would one day land on him like a piano dropped from a window. He picked up the first stone, set it aside, picked up the next. Fiona watched from the kitchen window. She did not know why she was watching. She had guests arriving in 2 hours, a toilet that would not stop running in room 3, and a booking website that kept listing her property as temporarily closed, no matter how many times she updated it. She did not have time to stand at a window watching a strange man pick up rocks. But there was something about the way he moved, deliberate, careful, each stone examined, turned, placed. Not the movements of a man who did this for a living. The movements of a man who was doing this to keep his hands busy, because if his hands stopped, the rest of him might stop too, and stopping was not something he could afford. She knew that feeling. She had tiled the bathroom floor herself, 3 months after her husband Callum died, not because she knew how to tile a floor, but because she needed to do something with her hands that was not screaming into a pillow at 2 in the morning. The tiles were slightly crooked. She did not care. They were hers. She had laid every one of them while Myri slept upstairs, and the grief sat on her chest like a bag of cement, and every tile was a small act of defiance against the universe that had taken a 30-year-old man off a fishing boat and put him at the bottom of the North Sea. Callum had been dead for 4 years. The grief had changed shape since then. It was no longer the bag of cement. It was more like a stone in her pocket. She carried it everywhere. Sometimes she forgot it was there. Then she would reach into her pocket for a coin or a tissue, and her fingers would brush against it and she would remember. And the remembering was not the sharp thing it used to be, but a dull, heavy thing, like pressing on a bruise. She turned away from the window, went upstairs to deal with the running toilet, flushed it 3 times, hit the cistern with the heel of her hand. The running stopped. The cure was temporary. Everything in this house was temporary. The hot water was temporary. The Wi-Fi was temporary. The roof was temporary. Fiona herself sometimes felt temporary, a placeholder person keeping the lights on until someone more competent came along and took over. But no one was coming. She had figured that out about a year after Callum died. No one was coming to rescue her, or fix the roof, or make sense of the accounts, or deal with the suppliers, or hold Myri when she had nightmares about water. No one was coming, so Fiona would have to be enough, and most days she was, and on the days she was not, she talked to the rose bushes and pretended that counted as therapy. The guests arrived at 4, a retired couple from Edinburgh named the Hendersons, who had booked 3 nights and requested a room with a view. Fiona gave them room 2, which looked out over the garden. She briefly considered warning them about the state of it, then decided that managing expectations was a luxury she could not afford. The garden is undergoing renovation, she said, which was technically true in the same way that a building site is undergoing renovation. Mrs. Henderson smiled politely. Mr. Henderson asked about the Wi-Fi password. Fiona gave it to them, and then went downstairs and prayed silently that the router would hold out until at least tomorrow morning. Dinner was her responsibility. Briarstone House offered bed, breakfast, and an optional evening meal for an additional £12 per person, which covered ingredients, if she bought carefully, and her labor, if she did not count it, which she never did. Tonight was roast chicken, potatoes, and whatever vegetables had not gone soft in the bottom drawer of the refrigerator. She peeled carrots. She seasoned the chicken. She put it in the oven and set the timer, and then stood in the kitchen doorway looking out at the garden. Edward was still there. He had cleared the debris from the first collapsed section of wall and was laying stones. In 3 hours, He had rebuilt about 4 feet of wall. It was neat, precise. Each stone fitted against the next with the kind of patience that suggested either expertise or obsession, possibly both. Myri was sitting on the grass nearby, drawing in her sketchbook. She was far enough away to not be in his way, and close enough to be in his business. She had a talent for that. "Myri," Fiona called. "Dinner." Myri stood up, showed her drawing to Edward, and ran inside. Edward looked at the drawing for a moment. Then he set down his stone, and sat on the wall he had built, and stared at the moorland beyond the garden. His shoulders dropped. His hands hung between his knees. He looked, in that moment, like a man who had just been shown something small and kind, and was not sure what to do with it. Fiona closed the door, set the table, fed her daughter, served dinner to the Hendersons, who complimented the chicken, and asked if the garden was maintained by staff. Fiona said yes, she had recently hired a gardener. She said it as if it were a normal, planned decision, and not something that had happened because a hollow-eyed man had appeared on her doorstep with a circled newspaper ad, and a sadness so large it was practically visible, trailing behind him like a coat he could not take off. After dinner, she made a plate of leftover chicken, potatoes, and carrots. She covered it with cling film. She walked it out to the cottage and left it on the front step. She did not knock. She did not leave a note. She just set it down and went back inside. In the morning, the plate was on the kitchen windowsill, washed and dried. They did not talk about it. The days took on a rhythm. Edward arrived in the garden at 7 each morning, earlier than Fiona had asked, earlier than she was awake. She would come downstairs at 6:30 to start breakfast prep and see him already out there, moving stones or pulling weeds or digging out the remnants of the old vegetable patch. He worked methodically, section by section, as if the garden were a problem he could solve through sheer persistence. And slowly, impossibly slowly, it began to change. The first wall section was finished by the end of his 3rd day. The second took 4. By the end of his first week, the front path was clear of rose brambles. The lawn had been cut with a scythe he had found in the shed, and the compost heap had been dismantled and relocated to a proper bin he had built from scrap wood. Fiona paid him on Friday. She counted the notes out on the kitchen counter and held them out to him, and he took them and put them in his pocket without counting. She had overpaid by £20. He either did not notice or did not care. She suspected the latter. A man who wore those boots and did not flinch at £12 an hour was not a man who thought about money in the way normal people thought about money. She wanted to ask. She had 100 questions lined up behind her teeth, like passengers waiting to board a train. Where did you come from? Why are you here? Who are you really? What happened to you? Why do you sometimes stop in the middle of a task and stare at nothing for so long that I think you have forgotten where you are? She asked none of them. She had made a deal. No questions. She would keep her end. But the deal did not extend to Mary. Her daughter had adopted Edward the way some children adopt stray animals, with a cheerful, possessive certainty that the creature in question had been waiting for exactly her. Every afternoon after school, Myri would appear at the garden wall and begin her interrogation. "Edward, why do you not have a car?" "I do. It is at the pub." "Why is it at the pub?" "I do not need it. Everyone needs a car." "I am not everyone." Mary considered this. "Do you have children?" A pause. The kind that had weight in it. The kind Fiona could feel from 20 feet away, through the kitchen window, through the glass and the stone, and whatever armor Edward Ashworth had built around himself. "No," he said. "Did you want them?" "Mary," Fiona called from the window. Mary ignored her. She had inherited her father's selective hearing, along with his freckles. "My dad is dead," she said to Edward, with the blunt factuality of a child who had processed this information long enough for it to become simply a thing that was true, like the sky being blue or biscuits being better than fruit. "He drowned." Edward set down his trowel. "I am sorry." "It is okay. I do not remember him very much. Mum says he was funny. She says he could make anyone laugh. She does not laugh very much now, though." Mary paused, considering whether to continue. She continued. "Are you married?" "I was." "What happened?" The pause again, longer this time. Fiona had moved to the kitchen door, ready to intervene. ready to pull Mary inside and apologize, and explain that her daughter did not understand boundaries, which was true, but also beside the point. Because the real issue was that Fiona did not want to hear the answer. She did not want to know what lived inside that pause. She already knew it was something that could break the quiet arrangement they had built, the careful distance she maintained, system of plates on the step, and clean plates on the windowsill, and £12 an hour in cash. She died, Edward said. Mary nodded. Like my dad. Yes, like your dad. What was her name? Catherine. That is a nice name. Mary reached through the wall gap and placed a biscuit on the stone. You can have this. I always bring two, and I already ate mine. Edward picked up the biscuit, looked at it, looked at the small hand retreating through the wall gap. Thank you, Mary. You are welcome. My mum says you are shy, but I think you are just sad. Sad people do not talk as much. My mum was like that for a while, but then she started yelling at the roses and she got better. Mary hopped off whatever she had been standing on and ran back toward the house, her school bag bouncing against her back. Edward sat in the dirt with the biscuit in his hand and did not move for a long time. Fiona watched from the kitchen doorway. She turned around and went back to the stove. The toast was burning. The toast was always burning. She had been burning toast every morning since Callum died, as if some part of her brain had permanently reassigned the neurons responsible for monitoring bread to the task of keeping her upright and moving and alive, and the toast had simply become an acceptable casualty of survival. She scraped the black bits into the bin, made another slice, burned that one too. Edward was in the garden for 3 weeks before she heard him laugh. She was arguing with the climbing hydrangea on the south wall of the house. The hydrangea had been planted by the previous owners and had spent the last decade doing absolutely whatever it wanted, which was mostly growing sideways across the kitchen window and blocking the only natural light the room received. Fiona had been trimming it back every spring, and every summer it returned with the vengeful enthusiasm of a plant that had taken the trimming personally. Listen to me, she said to the hydrangea, secateurs in hand, standing on an overturned bucket. I am giving you until July. July. If you are not sorted by then, I am pulling you out by the roots. I do not care how long you have been here. This is my house, my window, my light. Do you understand? The hydrangea said nothing. Hydrangeas never do. I will replace you, Fiona continued, warming to her threat. I will put in a nice, well-behaved clematis. Something that stays where it is told. Something that does not have ambitions above its station. From behind the hedge, she heard it. A laugh. Not loud. Not theatrical. A breath of a laugh, the kind that escapes before a person can catch it, the kind that sounds like surprise, as if the body had remembered how to do something the mind had forgotten. Fiona froze on her bucket. She had not heard anyone laugh in this garden in a very long time. She herself laughed, occasionally, in the way that single mothers laugh, which is mostly at things that are not funny, because the alternative is crying. But this was different. This was the sound of something thawing. She did not turn around. She did not acknowledge it. She went back to threatening the hydrangea, and if she was slightly louder and slightly more dramatic in her threats, that was purely coincidental and had nothing to do with the possibility that she might hear that sound again. She did not hear it again, not that day. But she kept talking to the plants. Edward rebuilt the entire south wall in his 4th week. He also cleared the vegetable patch, turned the soil, and planted a row of lettuce and a row of carrots, from seeds he bought in the village with his own money. Fiona found out about the seeds when she went to pay him, and he waved off the deduction. I wanted to, he said, 2 words that contained, somewhere inside them, something that Fiona did not have a name for, but recognized anyway. The way you recognize a song from 2 notes, the way you know rain is coming before the first drop falls. She left it alone. The garden was changing. Not fast, not dramatically, but the way a room changes when someone opens a window and lets in air that has been missing so long you forgot the room was stuffy. The paths were clear. The lawn was level. The walls were solid. The roses had been pruned back to their beds and were, grudgingly, behaving. The vegetable patch was producing its first tentative green shoots, fragile and improbable in the Scottish soil. Guests noticed. A woman from London who stayed for 2 nights in early October told Fiona the garden was charming and left a 4-star review. Fiona read it 3 times. She had not received a 4-star review in over a year. Most of her reviews hovered between 2 and 3 stars, with recurring themes of dated decor, unreliable hot water, and nice host, shame about the facilities. 4 stars. Because of a garden. Because of a man who appeared out of nowhere and fixed her walls, and planted her vegetables, and laughed behind her hedge when she argued with a hydrangea. She put the kettle on, made 2 cups of tea, carried one out to the garden, and set it on the stone wall beside where Edward was working. He looked at the tea, looked at her. 4 stars, she said. He picked up the cup. Is that good? It is a miracle. I have been averaging 2.5. A woman last month gave me 1 star, because the shower curtain was the wrong shade of blue. The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile. The ghost of a smile. The place where a smile would be if the man behind the face would let it happen. What shade was it? He asked. Teal. What shade did she want? I do not know. She said teal was aggressive. She said it made her feel confronted. The ghost moved a fraction of a millimeter closer to becoming an actual smile. Confronted by a shower curtain. Welcome to the hospitality industry. He drank his tea. She stood beside the wall. Neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence was not awkward. It was the silence of 2 people who had each spent so long being alone that the presence of another person who expected nothing was, in itself, a kind of rest. Fiona went back inside, burned the toast. That night, she lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the man in her garden. She thought about his boots and his accent and the way he had paused when Mary asked if he was married. She thought about Catherine. She thought about Callum. She thought about how grief had its own geography, its own map, and how strange it was to meet another person who had been traveling that same country, and how you could recognize them by the way they held their shoulders, by the way they drank their tea, by the way they laughed, which was always a little bit late and a little bit surprised, as if they were not sure they were still allowed. She rolled onto her side, closed her eyes. In the cottage, Edward sat at the table and turned the photograph face up. Catherine on their wedding day, 27 years old, laughing at something the photographer had said. Her veil caught in the wind. He looked at it for 10 seconds, then he turned it face down again. He washed his teacup, set it beside the plate Fiona had left on the step, which he had washed and dried but not yet returned. He went to bed. The mattress sagged. The window rattled. The wind came from the north, and the cottage groaned. And for the first time in 6 months, Edward Ashworth fell asleep before midnight. November arrived in the Highlands, the way debt arrives in a bank account, all at once and without apology. The temperature dropped. The wind turned sharp. The sky became a permanent shade of gray that was not dramatic enough to be called stormy, and not light enough to be called overcast. It was just gray. Aggressively, relentlessly, insistently gray. The kind of gray that made people say things like, "At least it is not raining," until it started raining, which it did, constantly, in a thin, sideways drizzle that got into everything: bones, boots, spirits. Fiona had 3 bookings for November. 3. 2 of them canceled within the first week. One cited weather, the other cited personal reasons, which Fiona suspected meant they had looked at the forecast and decided that paying £100 a night to shiver in a bed and breakfast with unreliable hot water was not their idea of a holiday. She could not blame them. She sometimes questioned the decision herself, and she lived here. The one remaining booking was a man named Simon Fletcher, a birdwatcher from Bristol, who arrived on the 9th of November, with binoculars around his neck, a waterproof jacket that could have survived a hurricane, and an enthusiasm for the Highland landscape that bordered on clinical. He wanted to see a golden eagle. He had been trying to see a golden eagle for 7 years. He spoke about golden eagles the way other men spoke about football, with a mixture of passion and mild delusion. Fiona liked him immediately. "The garden is looking splendid," Simon said at breakfast on his first morning, gazing out the dining room window at Edward's handiwork. "Do you do the gardening yourself?" "I have someone," Fiona said. "He is very dedicated." This was an understatement of the kind that Fiona specialized in. Edward was not dedicated. Edward was consumed. He was in the garden before dawn now, wearing a wax jacket she was fairly sure had not been purchased at any shop accessible to normal human beings, working through the rain, as if precipitation were a rumor he had chosen not to believe. He had finished the walls. He had built raised beds from reclaimed timber. He had transplanted the surviving rose bushes into a border along the south wall, where they would get maximum light. He had done something to the lawn that involved drainage channels and topsoil, and a level of expertise that suggested he had either studied horticulture extensively or had grown up on the kind of property where people took lawns very, very seriously. Fiona suspected the latter. She suspected a lot of things about Edward Ashworth, and she kept all of them to herself, in the same mental drawer where she kept her passwords and her savings balance, and the name of the specialist who had told Callum not to go out in rough seas. Edward did not eat breakfast at the house. He did not eat lunch there either. He ate dinner in his cottage, from plates that Fiona left on his step every evening, because she had decided during his second week that no human being could survive on tinned soup and stale bread, and she was not going to have a man starve to death in her back garden no matter how determined he was to be left alone. They had established a system. She cooked. She plated. She left it on the step. He ate. He washed the plate. He left it on the windowsill. Neither of them discussed it. It was the most intimate non-relationship Fiona had ever had with another human being, and she was not sure what to do with that information, so she did what she always did with information she could not process. She told the rose bushes. "He does not talk," she said to the climbing rose by the kitchen door, while pruning it on a Tuesday afternoon. "I do not mean he is quiet, Edith. Quiet people still say things when you talk to them. He says things, but he does not talk. There is a difference. Quiet is when you choose not to speak. He is not choosing. He has forgotten how. Or he does not trust himself to. I cannot figure out which one it is." The rose offered no opinion. "And the boots. Have you seen the boots? Those boots cost more than my car. And the jacket. And the way he holds a teacup, like it might be porcelain, even though it is a chipped mug from a charity shop. He holds it by the handle, not the body, the handle, like he was taught by someone who thought teacup holding was a skill that mattered." She clipped a dead branch. "I am not interested in him. Let me be clear about that. I am observant. There is a difference." The rose said nothing, which was probably for the best, because Fiona was not telling the truth, and they both knew it. Edward was rebuilding the greenhouse. Fiona had not asked him to. The greenhouse had been on her property since before she bought it, a Victorian structure with a cast-iron frame and glass panels, most of which were cracked or missing entirely. It sat at the far end of the garden like a beautiful skeleton, all bones and no skin, a monument to someone else's ambitions. She had always meant to restore it. She had never had the money, or the time, or, honestly, the energy. After Callum, energy became a thing she rationed, and greenhouses did not make the cut. But Edward had started clearing the interior without asking. He removed the broken glass. He scraped lichen off the iron frame. He oiled the hinges of the door, which had not opened in at least 5 years. And then, one morning, Fiona came downstairs and saw a delivery lorry in the driveway. A man in overalls was unloading panes of glass. New panes. Custom cut. She walked outside. Edward was directing the delivery man with the casual authority of someone who was used to being in charge of things, which did not match the gardener persona at all, which Fiona noticed, which she filed away, which she did not mention. "What is this?" she asked. "Glass," Edward said. "I can see it is glass. I am asking why there is glass being delivered to my property that I did not order." He looked at her. That flat gray gaze. "The greenhouse is not useful without glass. I did not ask you to fix the greenhouse. You did not ask me to fix the vegetable patch either. The vegetable patch did not arrive on a lorry with an invoice." A pause. She saw something flicker behind his eyes, something that might have been embarrassment, or might have been the realization that he had miscalculated, that he had done the thing rich people do without realizing they are doing it, which is solve problems by spending money, and assume the gesture will be received as kindness, rather than as a reminder of the gap between his resources and hers. "I will pay for it," he said. "It is not your expense." "Edward, that is not the point." "What is the point?" Fiona opened her mouth, closed it. What was the point? The point was that she had built her life on self-sufficiency, on needing no one, on being the person who fixed things and paid for things and handled things, and when someone else did it, even kindly, even without strings, it felt less like help, and more like a crack in the wall she had built around herself, and cracks spread. "The point," she said carefully, "is that this is my house, and I make the decisions about what gets fixed and when." He held her gaze. "You are right. I apologize." He meant it. She could tell. He was not a man who apologized easily or insincerely. He apologized the way he did everything, with a precision that suggested he had thought about it before saying it. "Keep the glass," Fiona said, "but next time, ask me first." He nodded. She went back inside. She leaned against the kitchen counter and pressed her palms against her eyes, and felt the frustration drain out of her like water from a cracked jug, replaced by something more complicated, something that was part gratitude, and part fear, and part the terrible, unwelcome recognition that she was beginning to rely on the presence of this man in her garden, and reliance was the most dangerous thing in the world for a woman who had already lost someone she relied on to the sea. Edward finished the greenhouse in 12 days. He worked through rain. He worked through a hailstorm that drove Simon Fletcher indoors, with a broken umbrella and a string of words that were not suitable for publication. He worked through a morning so cold that Fiona's breath crystallized on the inside of the kitchen window. He fitted every pane of glass with the obsessive care of a man who was building something that had to be perfect, because if it was perfect, then the act of building it meant something, and if it meant something, then he meant something, and meaning was the thing he had driven 9 hours to find or escape. He was no longer sure which. The finished greenhouse was extraordinary. The iron frame, cleaned and painted, looked as if it belonged in a botanical garden. The glass caught the thin November light and held it. Inside, the air was warmer, sheltered, a small pocket of calm in the middle of the Highland wind. Edward had built shelving from reclaimed wood. He had installed a water collection system that channeled rain from the roof into a barrel. He had, Fiona noticed, thought about this. Not just thrown money at it, thought about it, studied it, made it right. She stood inside the greenhouse on the evening he finished, while Myri explored the shelves and pretended they were the decks of a pirate ship. Edward stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching Myri with an expression that Fiona could not read and did not try to. "It is beautiful," Fiona said. He looked at her. For a moment, the mask slipped. Not the polite mask, the one he wore when he said please, and thank you, and good morning. The deeper mask, the one underneath, the one that kept everything locked in a vault, that no one had the combination to. It slipped, and she saw what was behind it, just for a second, and what was behind it was grief, so raw and so vast that it took her breath away. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was so familiar. Because she had seen it in her own mirror, for months, after Callum, that look of a person who has lost the thing that made the world make sense, and has not yet found a replacement, and is terrified they never will. Then the mask came back. He blinked, looked away. "I am glad you like it," he said. He walked back to his cottage. Fiona stood in the greenhouse with her daughter, and listened to the rain hitting the glass roof, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, as if something in her life was being built instead of falling apart. Simon Fletcher saw his golden eagle on the 14th of November. He came thundering down the stairs at 6 in the morning, binoculars flailing, breakfast forgotten, and sprinted into the garden to get a better angle. The eagle was circling above the moorland, beyond the property, riding the thermals with the effortless arrogance of a creature that knew it was the most impressive thing in the sky. Simon stood in the middle of the lawn, with tears streaming down his face, and his binoculars pressed so hard against his eyes that he would have bruises later. He did not care. Edward was already in the garden. He watched Simon watch the eagle. 7 years, Simon said, his voice cracking. 7 years I have been looking. Edward nodded. He looked up at the eagle. Then he looked at Simon, at this middle-aged man from Bristol standing in a Scottish garden at dawn, crying over a bird, and something happened to Edward's face that Fiona, watching from the window, had never seen before. He smiled. Not the ghost, not the corner of the mouth. An actual, real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and changed his whole face, and Fiona had to look away, because it did something to her chest that she was not prepared for. A tightening, a warmth, a feeling like standing too close to a fire after being cold, for a long time. The kind of warmth that is almost painful because your skin has forgotten what warm feels like. She burned the toast. She did not care. She burned the toast and scraped it and ate it herself and did not care about anything except the image of that smile, which was now living in her head like a tenant who had moved in without signing a lease. Simon left the next day, after shaking Edward's hand for a full 30 seconds and promising to leave a 5-star review. He did. The review mentioned the garden, the greenhouse, the hospitality, and, inexplicably, the teal shower curtain, which Simon described as bold and characterful. Fiona printed it out and pinned it to the kitchen corkboard. 5 stars. From a man who had found a golden eagle after 7 years. Perhaps things were looking up. The electricity bill arrived on the 16th. Things were not looking up. Things were looking at a number with 3 digits before the decimal point, and no way to pay it without dipping into the savings account that Fiona had been protecting, like a dragon guarding its hoard. The savings account that was supposed to be for Mary's schooling, for emergencies, for the future, that Fiona was building one burned piece of toast at a time. She sat at the kitchen table with the bill and a cup of tea that went cold while she stared at the number. She added it to the other numbers in her head. The roof repair she had been putting off, the boiler that needed servicing, the insurance that was due in January, the property tax that was due in February, the website hosting fee that was due next week. The numbers stacked up like stones in a wall, and unlike Edward's wall, they were not holding anything together. They were burying her. Myri was at school. Edward was in the garden. Fiona was alone at her kitchen table, with a cold cup of tea, and a pile of numbers that did not add up, and she did the thing she always did when the world pressed too hard. She went outside and talked to the roses. "I am not going to lose this house," she said to the climbing rose by the door, her voice steady, her eyes not steady at all. "I am not going to let that happen. I have put too much into this place. Callum and I bought this house with everything we had, every penny, every dream. He wanted to see it full of people. He wanted to see Mary grow up here. He wanted—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. He wanted a lot of things that did not happen. She picked a dead leaf off the rose, held it in her palm. "I just need one good season. That is all. One good summer. If I can get through winter and fill the spring bookings and get the website sorted and fix the roof before the damp gets worse, I can make it. I know I can. I just need the roof to hold, and the boiler to last, and the universe to stop throwing things at me for 5 consecutive minutes." She crushed the leaf, let the pieces fall. "And I need to stop paying a gardener I cannot afford." She said it out loud, because saying it made it real, and real things could be dealt with. She could not afford Edward. £12 an hour, 25 hours a week, that was £300 a week, that was £1,200 a month. That was money she did not have, money she was pulling from the reserves, money that should be going to the electricity bill and the roof and Myri's new school shoes, which she had needed for a month, but which Fiona kept putting off, because shoes could wait, but a gardener, who smiled once in 6 weeks, and ate her leftovers, and made her chest do inconvenient things, apparently, could not. She had to let him go. She stood in the garden in the thin November rain, and looked at the walls he had rebuilt, and the beds he had planted, and the greenhouse he had restored, and the lawn he had rescued, and she thought about Callum, who would have liked Edward, who would have understood Edward, who would have sat on that wall with him, in companionable silence, and eventually made him laugh with some terrible joke about fishing or football or the weather. Because Callum could make anyone laugh. That was the thing people always said about him. He could make anyone laugh. And Fiona had not been able to make anyone laugh since he died, least of all herself. She went inside. She would tell Edward tomorrow. She would tell him she could not afford him anymore. She would thank him for everything he had done. She would offer him a good reference. She would be professional and kind and firm, and she would not think about the smile, and she would not think about the greenhouse, and she would not think about the way Mary talked about him at dinner every night, as if he were a character in a story she was telling herself. A story where the sad man in the garden eventually stopped being sad. She put the kettle on, made tea, did not burn the toast because there was no toast to burn. There was no bread. She had forgotten to buy bread. She sat down at the kitchen table with her tea and the electricity bill, and the absence of bread, and the weight of every decision she had to make pressing on her shoulders like the highland sky, and she put her head in her hands and breathed. Tomorrow. She would deal with it tomorrow. She did not deal with it tomorrow. She did not deal with it the day after that either. She kept finding reasons to postpone the conversation, reasons that were thin and transparent, and that she knew were excuses. But she clung to them anyway, the way a person clings to a leaking raft, not because it is seaworthy, but because the alternative is open water. The reason she gave herself on Wednesday was that Edward was in the middle of planting bulbs, and it would be rude to interrupt. The reason on Thursday was that Mary had a school project about plants and needed Edward's help identifying species in the garden, and Fiona could not fire a man in the middle of teaching her daughter the Latin name for primrose. The reason on Friday was that it was raining. The reason on Saturday was that Edward brought her a bunch of flowers from the garden, the first flowers the revived beds had produced, a small, imperfect bundle of late chrysanthemums and early snowdrops, tied with kitchen string. He left them on the kitchen windowsill next to the washed plate. He did not leave a note. He did not need to. Fiona put them in a jar on the kitchen table and sat looking at them for a long time. And the reason she did not fire Edward on Saturday was because she could not fire a man who had just given her the first flowers anyone had given her in 4 years. And she was not going to examine that too closely, because if she examined it, she would have to name what she was feeling, and naming it would make it real, and real things could break, and she had been broken enough. Sunday, she decided, she would do it on Sunday. On Sunday, something happened that changed everything. The storm hit Craigenmore at 2 in the morning, not a Highland drizzle, not one of the routine gray squalls that rattled the windows and made the pipes sing. This was the kind of storm that people named afterward, the kind that rearranged geography, that turned rivers into roads and roads into rivers, that came screaming down from the mountains with the focused rage of something that had been insulted personally by human civilization. Fiona woke to the sound of the roof. Not the usual groaning, a crack, sharp, final. The kind of sound a building makes when it stops negotiating with physics and starts surrendering. She was out of bed before her brain caught up with her body, feet hitting the cold floor, hands reaching for the light switch. The power was out. Of course it was out. She grabbed her phone, turned on the torch, and ran to Mary's room. Mary was sitting up in bed, awake, calm, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had one ear and no name. She looked at her mother, with the preternatural composure of a child who had learned early that panic was a luxury. "The roof," Mary said. "I know. Is it going to fall?" "No, nothing is falling. We are fine." Fiona scooped Mary up, blanket and rabbit and all, and carried her downstairs. She set her on the sofa in the sitting room, which was on the ground floor, and had a solid ceiling and walls that did not make death noises. She kissed Mary's forehead, told her to stay put, went back upstairs with the torch. Room 4. The ceiling in room 4 had a crack running from the window to the light fixture, and as Fiona watched, a drip of water appeared at the crack's midpoint and fell to the carpet. Then another drip, then another. She did not swear. She wanted to. She had a vocabulary of profanity that she had developed over 4 years of single motherhood and small business ownership that would have impressed a sailor and scandalized a vicar. But swearing would not fix the roof, and she did not have time for things that did not fix the roof. She went to the linen closet, got a bucket, put it under the drip, went to the window and looked out. She could see nothing. Rain, darkness. The garden was invisible. The cottage was invisible. Everything was invisible. The world had been swallowed. Another crack from above, louder. She felt it in the soles of her feet. She ran downstairs, grabbed her coat from the hook by the door, put on her boots, and went outside. The wind nearly knocked her down. The rain was horizontal. She struggled around the side of the house, holding the wall, and directed her torch upward. 3 tiles were gone from the section of roof above room 4. Not cracked, gone. Ripped off by the wind, and hurled into the darkness. Through the gap, she could see the exposed timber of the roof structure, old and gray, and not built for this kind of exposure. Water was pouring through the opening, directly into the ceiling cavity, directly into room 4, directly into the bucket she had placed, which would be full in an hour. She stood in the rain and looked at the damage, and felt a sensation she had become familiar with over the last 4 years. The cold, dropping sensation of a problem that was too big and too expensive and too urgent to defer. The sensation of the ground shifting under her feet. The sensation of falling while standing still. The roof had been on her list. It had been on her list for 2 years. She had known it needed work. She had known the tiles were old. She had gotten a quote 6 months ago and had put the letter in a drawer because the number on it had too many digits and not enough solutions. And now the storm had done what storms do, which is find the weakest point and push until it breaks. And the weakest point was 3 tiles above room 4. And the breaking was going to cost money. She did not have to fix a problem she could not ignore. A torch beam appeared from the direction of the cottage. Edward. He was running through the rain in his jacket and boots, his torch cutting through the downpour. He reached her, looked up at the roof, looked at her face. "How bad?" he shouted over the wind. 3 tiles. Room 4 is flooding." He did not ask permission. He went to the shed, came back with a tarpaulin and a length of rope, and before Fiona could form the words to stop him, he was climbing the ladder that leaned permanently against the east wall of the house. She opened her mouth, closed it, watched him climb through the rain to her roof, pulling the tarpaulin behind him. He worked for 20 minutes. She held the torch from below, her arms shaking, her face streaming with rain, watching the dark shape of him on the roof, moving with a certainty that did not match a gardener, that did not match a man who was supposed to be shy and quiet and broken. He secured the tarpaulin over the gap with the rope, anchoring it to the chimney stack and the guttering. It was not a repair. It was a bandage, but it would hold until morning. He climbed down. He was soaked through. His hands were raw from the rope. He stood in front of her in the rain and looked at her, and she looked at him, and for a moment neither of them moved, and the rain fell between them like a curtain. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, turned toward the cottage, stopped, turned back. "You should not be out here," he said. "You should not have been on my roof. Someone had to be. It is my roof." "Yes." He looked at her. She looked at him. The rain hammered down, the wind howled. And in the middle of all of it, in the dark and the wet and the cold, something passed between them that was not a word, and was not a touch, and was not anything that could be named or pinned down, but it was there, as real as the storm, as real as the damage, as real as the tarpaulin flapping on the roof above them. Edward walked back to the cottage. Fiona went inside, checked on Mary, who had fallen asleep on the sofa with her one-eared rabbit, checked the bucket in room 4, which was half full, changed it for a larger one. She sat on the stairs. She was shivering, not from the cold, from the accumulated weight of everything, the roof, the money, the storm, the man who climbed her roof in the dark, without being asked, and then walked away without expecting anything at all. She put her head against the banister, and closed her eyes, and let the shivering run through her like a current, and when it passed, she stood up and went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, because the power had come back on, and the kettle still worked, and tea was the only solution to everything in this country, and she was going to drink it, and stop shaking, and figure out what to do next, because next was the only direction left. Morning came gray and calm, as if the storm had never happened, as if the sky had simply been clearing its throat all night and was now finished. Fiona walked outside and looked at the damage in daylight. 3 tiles gone, tarpaulin holding. The garden was a mess, branches and debris scattered across the lawn that Edward had spent weeks leveling. 2 of the raised beds had been flooded. A section of fence along the east boundary had blown down. Edward was already out there, cleaning up, not the roof. The garden, his domain. He was raking debris and stacking branches and checking the greenhouse, which had survived the storm intact, every pane of glass holding. He had built it well. Fiona called the roofer, the same roofer who had given her the quote 6 months ago. He came out that afternoon, a man named Duncan Price with a beard like a hedge and hands like shovels. He climbed up, looked at the damage, climbed down, gave Fiona a number. 4,800 pounds. Fiona did not flinch. She had learned not to flinch at numbers. Flinching was a response that belonged to people who still had the luxury of being surprised by financial catastrophe. Fiona had been living with financial catastrophe for so long that they were practically roommates. "When can you do it?" she asked. 3 weeks. I am backed up from the storm. Everyone in the valley is calling. 3 weeks. with a tarpaulin on my roof. The tarp will hold. Whoever put it up did a decent job, tied it off properly. My gardener, Fiona said. Duncan looked at her with the expression of a man who had opinions about gardeners, who knew how to tie tarpaulins to roofs in a storm, but was wise enough to keep them to himself. He left. Fiona sat at the kitchen table with the quote and did the mathematics. She did the mathematics 3 times because she kept hoping the numbers would rearrange themselves into a more favorable configuration, which they did not, because numbers do not work that way, and neither does life. She did not have £4,800. She had $2,300 in her savings account, and that was Myrie's money, emergency money, do not touch money. She could take a loan. The bank had offered her one before, with an interest rate that made her feel faintly seasick. She could ask her mother, who lived in Inverness and had a pension and a small savings account and a habit of mentioning, every time she called, that Fiona should sell the house and move back to the city, as if 4 years of building a life and a business could be folded up like laundry and put away. She could not ask her mother. She would rather crawl across the Cairngorms in a nightgown. She stared at the quote. She stared at the crack in the plaster above the stove. She stared at the jar of chrysanthemums and snowdrops on the table, which were beginning to wilt. Edward knocked on the kitchen door. She looked up. He was standing outside, holding his gloves, rain-smeared and muddy. He nodded at the quote on the table. He could read the number from the door. "I can help with some of it," he said. "No. Fiona." "No, Edward, you are my employee. I pay you. You do not pay me. That is not how this works. I have savings. So do I. They are spoken for. Mine are not." She stood up, walked to the door, stood in it, looked up at him, because he was taller than her by at least 5 inches, and looking up at him meant looking into those gray eyes, and looking into those gray eyes meant seeing the offer for what it was, which was not charity, it was something else. Something that lived in the space between 2 people who had both lost someone and were trying, clumsily and cautiously, to figure out how to exist in the vicinity of another person without the other person becoming essential, because essential people left, or died, or drowned, and the leaving was always the worst part, worse than the grief, worse than the absence, because at least the absence was consistent. "I said no," she said, "and I mean it. I will figure it out. I always figure it out." He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he nodded, put his gloves back on, went back to the garden. That night, Fiona put Myrie to bed, cleaned the kitchen, checked the bucket in room 4, and sat down at the table with a notebook and a pen, and tried to make £4,800 appear from the margins of her life. She cut expenses. She deferred the boiler service. She calculated how many guests she would need in December and January to cover the gap, which was more guests than she had ever had in December and January combined, because no one wanted to holiday in the Highlands in midwinter unless they were birdwatchers or fugitives. She fell asleep at the table. She dreamed about water. 3 days later, Edward walked to the pub in Craighar after dark. His car was still parked behind the building, untouched. A black Range Rover, with English plates, that the locals had been whispering about for weeks. He did not get into the car. He opened the glove box. He took out his phone. It had been nearly 3 months since he had turned it on. When the screen lit up, the notifications piled in like passengers through a narrow door. Missed calls, messages, emails. His solicitor, his mother, his estate manager, the secretary of the House of Lords, a cousin he barely spoke to, his late wife's sister, all of them asking the same question in different words. "Where are you?" He ignored all of them. He opened his contacts. He called one number. "Edward." His solicitor's voice was flat with relief. "I have been trying to reach you for 3 months. Your mother has been beside herself. The estate requires—" "Philip, I need you to do something." A pause. Philip Hartwell had been the Lindmore family solicitor for 23 years. He had handled Edward's father's estate. He had handled Catherine's estate. He had handled Edward's disappearance with the quiet competence of a man who was paid very well to manage difficult situations without asking inconvenient questions. "Of course," Philip said. "The Highland Small Business Relief Fund. It is a charitable trust. I want you to make an anonymous donation. £5,000. Specify the recipient as Briarstone House, Craighimhor." Silence on the line. Edward, may I ask what? No. The estate accounts are. I do not care about the estate accounts. I will deal with them later. Right now, I need you to do this one thing. Anonymous. The recipient must not know the source. Can you do that? Yes. I can arrange it. Do it tonight. Edward, it is 9:30. Philip, I will do it tonight. Edward hung up, turned the phone off, put it back in the glove box, locked the car, walked back to Briarstone House in the dark, along the single-track road that wound through the valley, past fields where sheep stood motionless in the cold like woolly statues, past the river that was swollen from the storm and running fast and dark, past the stone bridge, where the road crossed the water, past everything that was not Briarstone House, until he reached the gate and walked through the garden he had rebuilt and into the cottage that was not his, and sat on the bed that sagged in the middle, and looked at the photograph of Catherine that he had turned face down again, and wondered whether what he had just done was kindness, or interference, or penance, and whether it mattered, and whether she would have approved. He thought she would have. Catherine had been a woman who noticed broken things and fixed them quietly, without fanfare, without waiting to be asked. She had once arranged the repair of a village church roof through the estate's charitable fund, without telling anyone, and when the vicar tried to thank her, she had told him she had no idea what he was talking about, and then winked at Edward across the dinner table, as if they shared a secret, which they did, which was that kindness done without credit was the purest kind, because it existed only for itself. Edward lay down on the sagging mattress. He thought about Fiona sitting at her kitchen table, with a number she could not meet, and a stubbornness that would not let her accept help. He thought about the way she talked to her roses. He thought about the way she burned toast. He thought about Mary's biscuits through the wall. He did not sleep for a long time, but when he did, he dreamed about gardens. 10 days later, the letter arrived. Fiona was at the kitchen table with Myri, who was eating cereal and talking about a boy at school named Hamish, who had put a worm in her lunchbox, a crime that Myri was processing with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice and the vocabulary of a 7-year-old, which meant the word disgusting was used 11 times in 3 minutes. Fiona was half listening and half sorting the post, which was the usual assortment of bills and flyers and a catalog for garden furniture she could not afford. She almost missed the letter. It was a plain white envelope, typed address, no return address visible. She opened it, while Mary continued her closing arguments against Hamish. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was from the Highland Small Business Relief Fund, an organization Fiona had heard of, but never applied to, because she had assumed, like most people who needed help, that the help was meant for someone else, someone who was properly struggling, someone worse off, someone who deserved it more. The letter informed her that an anonymous benefactor had made a donation to the fund, with the specific stipulation that the money be directed to Briarstone House, Craigenhore, for the purposes of essential building maintenance. The amount was £5,000. Fiona read the letter 3 times. She put it down on the table. She picked it up and read it again. She looked at the number. She looked at the crack in the plaster above the stove. She looked at the jar of dead flowers that she had not thrown away, because throwing them away felt like throwing away the gesture behind them. "Mum," Myri said, "are you crying?" "No. You are crying. I have something in my eye. Both eyes." Fiona put the letter down and wiped her face with the back of her hand, and laughed, and the laugh was the kind that comes out when crying and laughing get tangled up, and the body cannot decide which one to do, so it does both. And Myri looked at her with concern, and offered her a spoonful of cereal, which Fiona declined. "Something good happened," Fiona said. "What?" "Someone gave us money for the roof." "Who?" "I do not know. It was anonymous." Mary considered this. "Like Father Christmas." "Sort of, except Father Christmas does not pay for roof tiles. Maybe he should. Our roof needs it more than we need presents." Fiona pulled her daughter into a hug so tight that Mary squeaked. She held her for a moment, then she let go. Picked up the phone. Called Duncan Price. "Duncan, it is Fiona at Briarstone. I have the money. When can you start?" Duncan could start in 2 weeks. Fiona hung up. She sat at the table with the letter and the quote and the mathematics that now worked, that now added up, that now resolved into something other than disaster, and she felt a gratitude so large and so overwhelming that she could not contain it in the kitchen, so she went outside. She went to the rose bush by the door. "Someone saved us," she said. "I do not know who, I do not know why, but someone saved us, and I am going to find out who it was, and I am going to thank them, and then I am going to fix this roof, and fix this house, and make something of this place, because Callum wanted that, and Mary deserves that, and I owe it to whoever just believed in us enough to write a check." She touched the rose. Its thorns pricked her finger. In the garden, behind the hedge, Edward set down a stone and closed his eyes. He could hear her voice. He could not hear the words. He did not need to. He picked up the next stone, set it in the wall. The roof was fixed in December. Duncan and his crew worked for 4 days, replacing not just the 3 missing tiles, but reinforcing the entire section that had weakened. They checked the rest of the roof while they were up there and pronounced it sound for another 10 years, which was the most optimistic thing anyone had said to Fiona since her bank manager told her the mortgage was approved 5 years ago. The surplus from the donation, after the roof, was £200. Fiona put it toward the boiler service. The boiler man came. The boiler was serviced. The hot water became reliable. Fiona updated the website. Hot water guaranteed. She felt ridiculous typing it. She typed it anyway. December bookings trickled in. A family from Glasgow for a weekend. A couple celebrating their anniversary. 2 women on a walking holiday who were either very fit or very optimistic, given the weather. Each booking was a small victory, a stone in the wall of Fiona's financial survival, and she treated each one with the meticulous care of a woman who understood that her livelihood depended on strangers choosing her house over every other option, and choosing it again, and telling their friends. Edward continued to work. The garden in winter was a different kind of project, slower, quieter, focused on preparation rather than display. He mulched the beds. He pruned the fruit trees he had discovered at the far end of the garden. 2 apple trees and a pear tree, old and neglected but alive. He built a cold frame for the greenhouse to extend the growing season. He repaired the garden gate, which had been hanging from one hinge for as long as Fiona could remember. He spoke a little more now, not much, but the sentences were longer, and sometimes they contained something that was almost humor, a dryness that caught Fiona off guard, a precision in his observations that made her suspect he was considerably more intelligent than he was pretending to be, which, combined with the boots and the accent and the teacup grip and the tarpaulin tying skills, added up to a picture that did not match the job description. She did not push. She had made a deal. No questions. But the questions were there, stacked behind her teeth, growing louder, and she was beginning to suspect that the answers, when they came, would change everything. For now, though, she had a roof that did not leak, a garden that was becoming beautiful, and a gardener who ate her leftovers and rebuilt her walls and climbed her roof in storms and made her chest do things she was not prepared for, and she was going to hold on to all of it, every imperfect piece, because imperfect was still standing, and standing was enough. It had to be enough. Christmas in the Highlands was not what the brochures promised. The brochures promised snow-dusted landscapes and roaring fires, and the kind of quiet, picturesque solitude that looked good in photographs and felt, in practice, like being trapped inside a very cold painting. What actually happened was rain. More rain, occasional sleet. One spectacular hailstorm on the 22nd that sounded like someone dropping marbles on the roof. And underneath all the weather, the deep, relentless darkness of a Scottish winter, where the sun rose at 9:15 and gave up by 3:30, as if it too had looked at the weather forecast and decided not to bother. But Fiona had 4 guests booked for Christmas. The Glasgow family had extended their stay. A retired professor named Leonard Finch had booked the week between Christmas and New Year because, he said, he wanted to work on his book in peace, and his flat in Aberdeen offered neither peace nor functional heating. Fiona did not ask what the book was about. She gave him room 1, which had the best radiator and the weakest Wi-Fi, which she suspected was exactly what a man trying to write a book needed. Myri's school broke up on the 20th. This meant Myri was home full-time, which meant Myri was in the garden full-time, which meant Edward's previously solitary working hours were now accompanied by a running commentary from a 7-year-old who had questions about everything and patience for nothing. Edward, why do plants sleep in winter? They do not sleep exactly. They conserve energy. That is sleeping. It is more like resting. Resting is sleeping. Fine, they sleep. Why? Because the days are short, and the cold makes it difficult to grow. Do you sleep more in winter? A pause. No. Why not? I have always been a poor sleeper. My mum says warm milk helps. Your mum knows many things. She says that too. She says she knows everything, except how to fix the Wi-Fi. Fiona, listening from the kitchen where she was making mince pies, tried very hard not to laugh. Christmas Eve arrived with a light frost that turned the garden silver and made the world look, for once, like the brochures. Fiona woke at 5 to start preparations. She had agreed to provide Christmas dinner for her guests, which was ambitious given that her oven had a temperamental relationship with its own thermostat, and her largest roasting tin had a dent in the corner that made everything cook unevenly. But she had planned. She had lists. She had a turkey that was slightly too large for the oven, which she was going to make fit through a combination of engineering and optimism. By noon, the kitchen smelled like sage and butter, and the particular brand of chaos that only happens when one person is trying to cook for 9 people in a kitchen designed for 3. Mary was helping, which meant she was eating raw carrots and asking questions. Is Edward coming to dinner? Fiona stopped peeling potatoes. She had not thought about it. She had thought about the turkey and the potatoes and the gravy and the cranberry sauce and the bread rolls and the table settings and whether she had enough chairs. But she had not thought about Edward, which was a lie. She had thought about Edward constantly. She had thought about him every morning when she saw him in the garden, and every evening when she left his plate on the step, and every night when she lay in bed, and tried not to think about the smile she had seen exactly once, and had been replaying in her memory, like a song she could not get out of her head. But she had not thought about whether he would be alone on Christmas. She put down the peeler, went to the window. He was out there, even today, cutting back the last of the dead growth along the fence line. Working. Always working. As if the work were a wall he was building between himself and everything else. Myri, set another place at the table. Myri grinned. She had a gap in her front teeth from a recently lost baby tooth, and the grin was half triumph and half empty space. I knew you would say yes. I have not asked him yet. He will say yes. You do not know that. He always says yes to us. Fiona stared at her daughter. Mary stared back with the serene confidence of a child who had figured out something her mother was still pretending not to know. Fiona dried her hands, put on her coat, walked out to the garden. Edward saw her coming. He set down his shears, stood up. He was wearing a wool jumper she had not seen before, dark green, and it made his eyes look less gray and more something else, something warmer, something that she was not going to describe even to herself, because describing it would mean acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would mean dealing with it, and she was not ready to deal with anything except this turkey, and these potatoes, and this specific, small question she was about to ask. It is Christmas Eve, she said. This was not the question. This was the preamble. I know, he said. I am making dinner. For the guests. There is a turkey. It is arguably too large. I have seen it. You carried it from the car 2 days ago. You needed both arms. I am asking if you want to eat with us. He looked at her. She saw the pause happening behind his eyes, the calculation, the weighing of solitude against company, of safety against risk, of the cottage with its sagging bed and its face-down photograph against a kitchen full of warmth and people and a child who called him by his name and a woman who burned toast and talked to roses and had never once asked him who he really was. Yes, he said. Thank you. 6 o'clock. Do not bring anything. We have too much food already. She turned and walked back to the house. She did not look back. She could feel him watching her. She could feel it like sunlight on the back of her neck, and it was the strangest feeling, being watched by someone who asked nothing, who wanted nothing, who was simply there, present, attentive, the way a gardener watches a garden, not to control it, but to understand it, to know when something needs water, and when something needs light, and when something needs to be left alone to grow. She went inside, checked the turkey, checked the potatoes, checked her face in the hallway mirror, and was annoyed to find that she was flushed, because the kitchen was hot, obviously. It was the kitchen heat. It had nothing to do with anything else. Edward arrived at 6 o'clock exactly. He had changed his clothes. He was wearing a white shirt, clean trousers, and the expensive boots, which he had polished. He looked like a different person. He looked like the person he had been before, the person in the photograph he kept face down, the person who stood on steps of great houses and smiled because smiling was something that happened naturally, instead of something that had to be coaxed out like a frightened animal from under a bush. Fiona opened the door, looked at him, looked at the shirt. "You clean up well," she said. "You have gravy on your cheek," he said. She wiped her cheek. He almost smiled. The ghost, hovering. Dinner was a controlled catastrophe, which was how Fiona preferred her events. The turkey was slightly overdone on the left side and slightly underdone on the right, because the dented roasting tin had done what the dented roasting tin always did. The potatoes were perfect. The carrots were adequate. The gravy was exceptional, because gravy was the one thing Fiona could make without thinking. The one recipe she had memorized so completely that she could produce it in a blackout during an earthquake, while being interrogated by a 7-year-old, which was roughly the conditions under which she had made it today. The Glasgow family, the Morrisons, had 2 children, who immediately attached themselves to Myrie and spent the meal comparing notes on which school subjects were worst. Leonard Finch, the professor, turned out to be excellent company, a man who had spent 50 years studying medieval Scottish history and could make the Battle of Bannockburn sound like a pub fight. He drank 3 glasses of wine and told a story about Robert the Bruce that involved a spider, a cave, and a deeply unlikely coincidence. And by the end of it, everyone at the table was laughing. Everyone except Edward. He was not unhappy. Fiona could see that. He was eating. He was listening. He was present, in the way he was always present, with that careful attention that made her feel, absurdly, as if she were being studied, as if he were trying to memorize the shape of the evening, the sound of the laughter, the way the candlelight caught the steam rising from the food, the way Myrie's hair fell in her face when she leaned forward to grab the breadbasket. But he was not laughing. He was holding something back. She could see the effort of it, the way his jaw tightened when the conversation turned to family, the way his hands went still when Leonard mentioned his late wife in an anecdote about a holiday in the Hebrides, the way he looked at the candles instead of the people, as if looking at the flame was safer than looking at the warmth. Myrie broke through it. She had been drawing something at the far end of the table, using the colored pencils she had received as an early Christmas present from her grandmother. She held up the drawing and showed it to the room. It was a picture of the garden, the walls, the greenhouse, the roses, the lawn, and in the middle of it, 2 stick figures. One was small with red hair, that was Mary. One was tall with dark hair and gray dots for eyes. "That is Edward," Mary announced. "He is the best gardener in the whole of Scotland." The table went quiet, not an awkward quiet, a warm quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when something true and simple is said by someone too young to know how much it weighs. Edward looked at the drawing. He looked at it for a long time. He reached across the table and took it from Myrie with both hands, carefully, the way you hold something fragile, the way you hold something that matters. "Thank you, Myrie," he said. His voice was steady. His eyes were not. Fiona stood up to clear the plates. She did not trust herself to sit still in that moment. She took the turkey platter to the kitchen and stood at the sink and pressed her hands flat against the counter and breathed, because something in her chest had come undone, some mechanism that she had been keeping wound tight for 4 years. And the undoing was not painful exactly, but it was frightening, because tight was safe and undone was not. She served the Christmas pudding. She had set it on fire with brandy, which was the only reliable tradition in her Christmas repertoire, and the blue flames danced across the surface, while the Morrison children gasped, and Mary counted the seconds, and Leonard Finch said something about medieval fire festivals that nobody listened to, because the pudding was on fire, and fire was inherently more interesting than history. After dinner, the Morrisons took their children upstairs. Leonard retreated to his room with a glass of whiskey and his manuscript. Mary fell asleep on the sofa in the sitting room, chocolate on her chin, her new pencils scattered around her like offerings. Fiona and Edward washed the dishes. She washed, he dried. They stood side by side at the sink. She handed him plates and glasses, and he dried them and put them away. And he knew where everything went, she realized. He knew which shelf the glasses lived on, and which drawer the cutlery went in, and where the big serving bowl sat, because he had been eating off her plates and returning them clean for 3 months, and he had been paying attention. And paying attention was its own kind of intimacy, the kind that lived in details, in the knowledge of which mug was hers, and which shelf was too high, and which drawer stuck, unless you lifted and pulled at the same time. They did not talk while they washed. The silence was comfortable. It was the silence of the plates on the step, and the plates on the windowsill, and the tea on the wall. The language they had built that did not require words, that existed in gestures, in the presence of one person, choosing to stand next to another person when they could have stood anywhere else. Fiona handed him the last pot. Their fingers touched. She did not pull away. He did not pull away. It lasted 1 second, maybe 2. The length of a heartbeat, the length of a breath, the length of the distance between not knowing and knowing. Then Fiona turned to check on Mary. Edward hung the tea towel on the hook. He put on his coat. He stood in the kitchen doorway. "Happy Christmas, Fiona." "Happy Christmas, Edward." He walked into the dark. She watched him cross the garden, his shape getting smaller until the cottage swallowed him. She closed the door. She picked up Mary from the sofa, carried her upstairs, tucked her in, kissed her forehead. She went to her own room, sat on the bed, looked at the ceiling. She did not talk to the roses that night. She did not need to. Whatever she would have said to them was sitting in her chest, fully formed and undeniable, and no amount of deflection or denial or selective deafness was going to make it go away. She lay down, closed her eyes, did not sleep for a very long time. In the cottage, Edward pinned Mary's drawing to the wall above the table. 2 stick figures in a garden, one small, one tall. He sat in the chair and looked at it, and the photograph of Catherine stayed face down, and the drawing stayed face up, and there was something in that arrangement that meant something he was not ready to articulate, a shift in the geography of his grief, a small but seismic rearrangement of which direction he was looking. Forward. He was looking forward. He was not sure when that had started. He turned off the light. He lay in the dark and listened to the silence of the Highland night, and the silence was not empty the way it used to be. It was full of the sound of dishes being washed, full of the sound of a child saying his name, full of the sound of a woman threatening a hydrangea with eviction, full of the smell of turkey and gravy and burned toast, full of the weight of a hand brushing his over a wet pot. He closed his eyes. He slept. January brought the worst of the winter, the kind of cold that made the water in the cottage taps run slow and the windows frost on the inside. Edward worked less in the garden during this period because the ground was frozen and the plants were dormant, and there was only so much pruning and maintenance a person could do before the work became make work and the make work became obvious. Fiona noticed. She noticed the way he lingered in the garden long after the useful tasks were done, rearranging tools in the shed, checking the greenhouse temperature for the 3rd time in a morning, walking the perimeter of the wall he had already inspected the day before. She understood. The work was not about the garden. The work was about having a reason to be here, a justification for his presence, a structure that kept him upright the way the iron frame kept the greenhouse standing. She made a decision. "I need help inside the house," she said one morning, handing him his tea over the garden wall. "Room 3 needs repainting. The bathroom tiles in room 5 are coming loose. The dining room floor has a squeak that drives guests mad. If you are interested." He looked at her. She saw the calculation behind his eyes. Inside the house was different from the garden. The garden was his territory, separate, bounded by walls he had built himself. Inside the house was her territory, her space, her world. The kitchen, where she burned toast, and the hallway where the lavender had given up, and the stairs where she sat when the weight got too heavy. "Yes," he said. "I am interested." She gave him the keys to the supply cupboard and the paint color for room 3, which was a shade called Highland Mist that was essentially gray but charged £3 more per tin for the privilege of having a romantic name. He painted room 3 in 2 days. The job was immaculate. Neat edges, no drips, no overlap. The kind of paintwork that made Fiona wonder, not for the first time, who this man had been before he was a gardener, because gardeners did not paint with the precision of someone who had been taught that details matter, that quality is not a suggestion, that doing something halfway is worse than not doing it at all. She watched him work. She brought him tea and sandwiches, and stood in the doorway of room 3, and watched his back as he cut in along the ceiling line, freehand, no tape, his hands steady, his breathing even, his focus total. There was something meditative about watching a person do careful work, something calming, like watching water flow, or clouds move, or fire burn. He caught her watching once, turned from the wall with the brush in his hand and a spot of Highland mist on his cheekbone, and looked at her with that gray gaze, and she saw something in it that she had not seen before, something that was not grief, and not guardedness, and not the flat, unplugged look he had arrived with. It was curiosity. He was curious about her. The realization hit Fiona in the stomach, not in the romantic, butterflies and fireworks way that books described, more like being punched gently by a fact she had been dodging for weeks. He was watching her the same way she was watching him, carefully, quietly, with the attention of someone who was trying to understand something without disturbing it. She left the doorway, went downstairs, burned the toast. He fixed the bathroom tiles. He fixed the squeaky floorboard. He repaired a cracked window frame in room 2, and replaced the broken latch on the garden gate, and rehung the front door, which had been sticking since autumn. Each task drew him further into the house, further into her life, further past the boundaries she had drawn between employer and employee, between inside and outside, between the woman she showed the world and the woman she was, at 2 in the morning, when the grief sat on her chest, and the house groaned around her, and the only light was the green glow of the smoke detector on the landing. He never crossed a line. He never said anything that was too much. He never touched her, not since the brush of fingers over the pot at Christmas. He was scrupulous about it, about the distance, about the propriety, about the careful, deliberate maintenance of a gap between them that was large enough to be safe and small enough to be felt. But the gap was shrinking. It was shrinking in the way that gaps shrink between people who see each other every day, not through dramatic gestures or declarations, but through accumulation, through the slow accrual of moments, tea on the wall, sandwiches in the doorway, a drawing on the fridge, a laugh behind the hedge, a brush of fingers over a wet pot. Each moment was a stone in a wall, and the wall was not the kind that kept people out. It was the kind that held things together. Fiona felt it. Edward felt it. Mary, who missed nothing, felt it most of all. "Mum," Mary said one evening, while Fiona was reading her a bedtime story. "Do you like Edward? He is a good gardener." "That is not what I asked." Fiona looked at her daughter. 7 years old. 7 years old, and already too clever by half. Already reading the room with the accuracy of a person 3 times her age. Already seeing the things that adults thought they were hiding. "I like him," Fiona said. "He is a kind man. He likes you too." "How do you know that?" "He looks at you the same way Dad looks at you in the photographs." Fiona closed the book. She sat very still for a moment. Then she kissed Myri's forehead, and turned off the lamp, and went to her room, and sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall, and felt everything she had been holding back come rushing at her all at once. Not like a wave, not like a flood, but like a thaw, slow and inevitable and impossible to stop. She did not cry. She had done enough crying. She sat with it instead. She sat with the weight and the warmth and the fear and the hope and the impossibility of loving someone new, when the person you loved before was still everywhere, in the walls, in the view, in the freckles on your daughter's face. She sat with it until it settled. Then she went to bed. In the cottage, Edward sat at the table with Mary's drawing above him and Catherine's photograph in front of him, face up for the first time in weeks. He looked at Catherine. He looked at the drawing. He looked at the space between them, which was the space between who he had been and who he was becoming, and the space was not a gap. It was a bridge. He put the photograph in the drawer. He did not turn it face down. He just put it away. Gently. The way you put away something you love, but no longer need to hold. He went to bed. He slept through the night. February was the month the internet discovered Briarstone House. Fiona did not know how it happened. One day she had 12 followers on her bed and breakfast social media page, most of whom were relatives, and one of whom was Simon Fletcher the birdwatcher. The next day she had 400, then 800, then 2,000. A travel writer named Lucy Graves had stayed at Briarstone in late January, a thin woman with sharp eyes and a notepad she carried everywhere like a weapon. Fiona had assumed she was a journalist. She had been correct. Lucy wrote a column for a popular travel magazine, and her piece about Briarstone, published online in early February, had gone viral in the specific, contained way that articles about charming Scottish bed and breakfasts go viral, which is to say, it was shared aggressively by a certain type of person who dreamed of leaving London and running a small business in the countryside, but would never actually do it. The article described the garden, at length. It described the restored Victorian greenhouse, and the dry stone walls, and the rose borders, and the vegetable patch that was already producing winter greens. It described the food. It described the view. It described the host, Fiona, as a woman who runs her establishment with the warmth of a friend and the competence of a general. It mentioned, briefly, a silent gardener whose work has transformed the grounds from neglect into something approaching art. Bookings flooded in. February, March, April, May. People wanted the room with the garden view. People wanted the greenhouse. People wanted the scones that Lucy Graves had described in terms that made them sound like a religious experience, which was generous, because Fiona's scones were good but they were not transcendent. They were scones, made with cold butter and self-raising flour, and the kind of practiced efficiency that came from making them every day for 3 years. Fiona sat at the kitchen table with her booking calendar and stared at it. Every weekend from March through June was full, several weekdays too. She had a waiting list. A waiting list. She had never had a waiting list. She had never had a list of any kind that was not a list of problems. "We are full," she said to the kitchen, to the crack in the plaster, to the empty chair where nobody sat. "We are actually full." She wanted to tell someone. She wanted to tell Callum. She wanted to call him and hear him whoop the way he whooped when something good happened, the way he had whooped when Myri was born, and when they got the mortgage, and when Scotland scored in the World Cup qualifiers. She wanted to hear that sound. She could not hear that sound. She went outside and told the roses instead. "We are booked through June," she said to the climbing rose, which had survived the winter and was showing early buds. "I am going to need to hire staff. I cannot do breakfast for a full house by myself. I need someone in the kitchen. I need someone to do the rooms. I need actual employees with actual wages and actual tax contributions. I need to be a real business." She paused, looked at the greenhouse, looked at the garden. "I need to tell Edward." She needed to tell Edward because the article had changed things. The garden was no longer a private project. It was now the primary attraction of her business. Guests were coming specifically for it. They were photographing it. They were reviewing it. They were expecting it to be maintained at the standard Lucy Graves had described, and maintaining that standard required Edward to be here, properly, permanently, not as a cash-in-hand arrangement between a woman who did not ask questions and a man who did not answer them, but as an actual employee, with a contract, and a salary, and a national insurance number, and a last name that led somewhere. And therein lay the problem. Because the moment she formalized Edward's employment, she would need his details, his full name, his address, his tax information, his identity, and she had spent 4 months very carefully not knowing any of that, because knowing it would break the arrangement, and the arrangement was the only structure holding this precarious, impossible, beautiful situation together. She went inside, made tea, sat at the table, stared at the booking calendar. She would deal with it tomorrow. Tomorrow came. She did not deal with it. She made breakfast for 2 guests, a pair of architects from Edinburgh who were photographing rural buildings. She served scones and eggs and bacon and toast that was, for once, not burned, which she took as a sign from the universe that things were trending upward. She cleaned the rooms. She did the laundry. She answered 14 emails from prospective guests. She updated the website. She ordered supplies. She did not talk to Edward about the employment situation. She did talk to the roses. "I am avoiding it," she told the rose by the door, while cutting back dead wood in the February chill. I know I am avoiding it. I do not need you to tell me I am avoiding it. I am aware. The issue is that asking for his national insurance number feels like asking for his soul. The man gives me his first name, and his silence, and his rebuilt walls, and his polished boots, and his face-down photographs, and I am supposed to walk out there and say, "Excuse me, Edward, I need your paperwork?" He will leave. If I push, he will leave. And if he leaves, she stopped. Set down the secateurs. If he leaves, I will be fine. I was fine before him. I will be fine after him. I do not need a gardener. I need a functioning boiler, and a reliable Wi-Fi connection, and a daughter who does not ask questions I cannot answer. She picked up the secateurs, cut a branch. The cut was too aggressive. The branch was not dead. "I cut a live branch," she said to the rose. "That is your fault for listening." Edward solved the problem himself. He knocked on the kitchen door one morning in the last week of February, and when Fiona opened it, he was holding a piece of paper. It was a printed form. An employment registration form, the kind you download from the government website, the kind that asks for name, address, national insurance number, bank details. He had filled it out. Fiona took the paper, looked at it, looked at the name. Edward Ashworth. National insurance number, filled in. Bank details, filled in. Address, listed as the cottage at Briarstone House. Previous employer, left blank. Emergency contact, a name she did not recognize, a London phone number. She looked at him. He looked at her. "The article changed things," he said. "You need proper staff. I understand that. I want to stay. And staying means doing this properly." She looked at the form again. Nothing on it revealed anything she did not already know. His name, his address, which was her property, a bank account, a phone number for someone in London. It was all surface. It told her nothing about the boots or the accent or the greenhouse glass or the teacup grip. It was a form that held his identity, the way a jar holds the sea, technically containing part of it, while missing everything that mattered. "Who is Philip Hartwell?" she asked, reading the emergency contact. "My solicitor." "Your solicitor is your emergency contact?" "He is the person most likely to know what to do in an emergency." Fiona studied his face. He was giving her the minimum. The absolute minimum required to satisfy the legal requirements, and not a syllable more. And she understood why, and part of her respected it, and part of her wanted to grab his shoulders and shake him until the truth fell out like coins from a pocket, because she was tired of the gap, tired of the careful distance, tired of standing on the edge of knowing and choosing, every day, to step back. But she did not shake him. She took the form, filed it, made him a cup of tea, and the arrangement continued, formalized now, official, a gardener on the books of a bed and breakfast in the Scottish Highlands, earning a proper wage, paying proper taxes, existing on paper in a way that was true enough to be legal and incomplete enough to be a lie. March arrived. The garden woke up. It happened the way spring always happens in the Highlands, reluctantly and all at once. One week the ground was frozen and gray and dead. The next week, green was pushing through everywhere, crocuses and snowdrops, and the early shoots of the bulbs Edward had planted in autumn, poking up through the soil like small, stubborn declarations of intent. The roses budded, the apple trees flowered, the vegetable patch, sheltered by the cold frame and the greenhouse, produced its first lettuce of the season, pale and delicate and slightly improbable. Guests noticed. The early spring visitors photographed the garden with the reverence of people who had spent the winter trapped in cities and had forgotten that the color green existed outside of traffic lights. They posted the photographs online. More bookings came in. Fiona hired help. A woman from the village named Helen Drummond, who had worked in hospitality for 15 years before her children were born, and who could clean a room in 12 minutes flat, including making the bed with hospital corners that a surgeon would have admired. Helen was efficient, cheerful, and completely without curiosity about other people's personal lives, which made her the ideal employee for a business run by a woman with a mysterious gardener on the premises. Helen and Edward circled each other like cats in a new territory, polite and cautious. Helen did the rooms. Edward did the garden. Their paths crossed at the kitchen, where Fiona provided tea and biscuits at 11 and 3, and where the three of them would stand in a loose triangle, drinking tea and talking about the weather, which in the Highlands was always worth talking about, because it was always doing something. Helen asked Fiona about Edward once, early in her employment. "He is very quiet," Helen said, in the tone of a woman who had noticed something and was deciding whether to pursue it. "He is a good gardener," Fiona said. "Those boots are not gardening boots. He has his own taste in footwear. I do not police boots." Helen looked at Fiona for a moment. Then she nodded and went back to the rooms, and the subject was not raised again, which was a testament to Helen's professionalism and possibly also to the look on Fiona's face, which had communicated, without words, that the topic of Edward's boots was closed for discussion. Spring deepened, the days got longer. The garden reached the state that Edward had been working toward since October, a condition that was not wild and not formal but something in between, a garden that looked as if it had always been this way, as if nature had arranged it perfectly, and a human had simply tidied up the edges. The roses climbed, the vegetables grew. The greenhouse was full of seedlings that Edward tended with the focused gentleness of a person caring for something that could not care for itself, and Fiona watched him through the kitchen window and felt the gap between them shrink a little more with every passing day. He was talking more now. Not much, not to everyone, but to her and to Mary. In the kitchen in the mornings, over tea in the afternoons, in the garden in the evenings when the light went golden and the highland air smelled like peat and grass, and the first hints of summer. He talked about plants. He talked about soil composition and drainage, and the particular challenges of gardening in acidic highland soil. He talked about his grandfather, who had taught him dry stone walling. He talked about books he had read. He talked about weather patterns and bird migration and the habits of the fox that had been visiting the bins, which he had named Gerald for reasons he would not explain. He did not talk about Catherine. He did not talk about his life before Briarstone. He did not talk about the boots or the accent or the greenhouse glass or the solicitor in London. He talked around the silence at his center, filling the edges of the conversation while leaving the middle empty, and Fiona let him, because she had learned, over 4 months of plates on the step and tea on the wall, that pushing Edward was like pushing a wall. The wall did not move. The wall waited until it was ready, and then it moved on its own, and the movement was worth the wait. Myrie's 8th birthday was in April. Fiona planned a small party, 6 children from school, games in the garden, a cake shaped like a rabbit, which was Myrie's current obsession, sandwiches, juice, the kind of controlled chaos that birthday parties for 8-year-olds always are, loud and messy and exhausting, and over in 3 hours, leaving behind a kitchen that looked like it had been ransacked by a very enthusiastic burglar who was only interested in crisps and cake. Edward built Mary a birdhouse. He built it from scraps of wood from the shed, and it was not a simple birdhouse. It was a miniature version of Briarstone House. He had carved the details by hand, the windows, the door, the chimneys, the small sign above the door that said Briarstone in letters so tiny, Fiona had to squint to read them. He had even carved a tiny climbing hydrangea on the south wall, which made Fiona laugh so hard she had to sit down on the garden bench and hold her stomach. Mary received the birdhouse with the gravity of a child receiving a crown. She held it in both hands and examined every detail, and then looked up at Edward, with an expression that made Fiona's chest do the thing again, the undoing thing, the thawing thing, the thing she had been trying to ignore since Christmas, and was failing at more spectacularly, with every passing week. "It is the best present I have ever got," Myrie said. "I am glad you like it," Edward said. "Can we put it in the garden, on the apple tree? That is a good spot. The birds will find it there." They hung the birdhouse together, Edward lifting Mary up so she could reach the branch, Mary hooking the wire over the wood, with the focused determination of a child who understood that this mattered, that this small house for birds was somehow connected to the large house for people, and that both of them needed someone to take care of them. Fiona watched from the kitchen door. Helen stood beside her, drying a mug. "He is good with her," Helen said. "Yes." "She adores him." "Yes." Helen looked at Fiona. Fiona looked at Helen. Something passed between them that was not a question, and was not a statement but was understood by both of them, the way things are understood between women who have children and histories, and the ability to read a situation without needing it spelled out. Helen went back to the rooms. Fiona went back to the kitchen. The birdhouse attracted blue tits within a week. Mary checked it every morning before school, standing on tiptoe beneath the apple tree, peering in through the tiny windows. She reported her findings to Edward each afternoon, with the seriousness of a field researcher delivering data. 2 birds, one is bigger. I think the big one is the mum. Could be the dad. Male blue tits are slightly larger. How can you tell which is which? The male has a brighter blue crown. Crown like a king? Exactly like a king. So the birds have royalty? Edward paused. A longer pause than the question warranted. In a manner of speaking. Mary nodded wisely. She had no idea how close to the truth she had landed. Neither did Fiona, who was listening from inside, and who added the pause to the long list of pauses she had been collecting since October, each one a small weight, each one a piece of a puzzle she was assembling without the picture on the box. She was running out of patience. Not with Edward, with herself, with her own willingness to not know, to not ask, to not push past the surface of this man who had walked into her life with nothing but a circled newspaper ad, and who had, through sheer quiet persistence, become the most important person in it after Myri. She was going to ask. She was going to sit him down and ask him who he was, and where he came from, and why his boots cost more than her car, and why his solicitor was his emergency contact, and why he held teacups by the handle, and why he could paint with the precision of a professional, and build with the skill of a craftsman, and garden with the knowledge of an expert, and why he had come here, to this falling-apart house in this forgotten corner of Scotland, and why he had stayed. She was going to ask all of it. She was going to ask tomorrow. She did not ask tomorrow. She asked the roses instead, and the roses, as always, did not answer, and the gap between knowing and not knowing grew smaller and smaller, until it was the width of a photograph, the width of a name, the width of a secret that was waiting to fall. The dinner was Fiona's idea and Edward's undoing. She had been thinking about it for weeks. Not the kind of thinking that leads to plans. The kind that circles, lands, takes off again, like one of Mary's blue tits trying to decide whether a branch is safe to sit on. Edward had been at Briarstone for nearly 6 months. He ate in his cottage every night. She left plates on the step. He left them on the windowsill. The system worked. The system was safe. The system was also, Fiona was beginning to realize, cowardly. The system kept them in separate rooms. Separate spaces. It let her feed him without sitting with him, care for him without facing him, know him without knowing him. It was the domestic equivalent of sending a letter when you could knock on the door, and Fiona, who had spent 4 years knocking on every other door life put in front of her, was tired of standing outside this one. She told him on a Tuesday. He was in the greenhouse, potting seedlings, his hands in soil up to his wrists. She stood in the doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun. "You are eating inside tonight," she said, "whether you like it or not." He looked up from his seedlings. Soil on his fingers, a smear on his forehead. "You cannot survive on tinned soup and leftover roast," she continued. "No human being should eat alone in an unheated cottage when there is a perfectly functional kitchen 20 meters away. The cottage has heating. The cottage has a stove with 2 burners and a grudge. That is not heating. That is a negotiation." Something moved in his face. The ghost. Closer to the surface now than it had been in October. Closer than it had been at Christmas. It was almost a smile. "What time?" he asked. 6. "Should I bring anything?" "You should bring yourself, and an appetite, and nothing else. I have too many vegetables from your garden, and I need someone to eat them." She left before he could argue. She went back to the kitchen and realized that her hands were shaking, which was ridiculous, because she had just invited a man to dinner, not diffused a bomb, but the shaking was there anyway, in her fingers, and her wrists, and somewhere behind her ribs, the tremor of a person who has been alone for a long time, and is about to stop being alone for an evening, and is not sure she remembers how. She made soup, leek and potato, from the leeks Edward had grown and the potatoes she had bought in the village because her own potatoes were not ready yet. She made bread. She had never made bread before. She found a recipe in a cookbook that had been sitting on the shelf since Callum bought it at a charity shop 3 weeks before he died. The spine uncracked, the pages stiff. She opened it. She found the bread recipe. She made the dough. It did not rise properly. The loaf came out of the oven dense and heavy, the kind of bread that could have been used as a building material. Fiona looked at it, considered starting over, decided that imperfect bread was still bread, and that Edward, who ate tinned soup for dinner, was not in a position to be critical. He arrived at 6. He had changed his shirt. He had combed his hair. He looked, she thought, like a man who was trying not to look like he had tried, which was the most endearing kind of effort, the kind that betrayed itself by its own concealment. Myrie was at Fiona's mother's house in Inverness for the night. A planned visit, a coincidence of timing. Fiona told herself this. She told herself that Myrie's absence was logistical, not strategic, and that she had not arranged it specifically so that she could have dinner with Edward without her daughter's running commentary, which would have included observations that Fiona was not prepared to hear spoken aloud by a child at a dinner table. She was lying to herself. She knew it. The Roses knew it. Possibly Edward knew it. They sat at the kitchen table. Fiona served the soup. Edward ate it, with the careful attention of a man who was tasting every ingredient and remembering where each one came from, which field, which row, which day of planting. They ate in silence for a few minutes, comfortable silence, the good kind. Then Edward put down his spoon. "You made bread," he said, looking at the dense loaf on the board between them. "I attempted bread. The result is debatable." He cut a slice. He ate it. His expression did not change, which was either politeness or proof that the man genuinely could not taste the difference between bread and a brick. "It is good," he said. "You are a terrible liar." "I am an excellent liar, actually. But this is not a lie. The bread is good." Fiona looked at him. "You said you are an excellent liar." He paused. She saw the moment he realized what he had said. Not the words themselves, which were harmless, but what they implied, which was that he had practice, that lying was a skill he had developed, that the man sitting at her kitchen table, eating her bad bread, was someone who knew how to be someone else, someone who had been being someone else for 6 months. "I did say that," he said quietly. Fiona picked up her glass of water, drank, set it down. "Edward, I made a deal with you in October. No questions. I have kept that deal. I have not asked about the boots. I have not asked about the accent. I have not asked about the glass for the greenhouse, or the way you hold a teacup, or the fact that your solicitor is your emergency contact. I have not asked because I said I would not ask, and I keep my word." She looked at him across the table. The candle between them was a stub she had found in the drawer, left over from Christmas, and it threw more shadow than light. "But I am going to break the deal now, not because I want to, because I have to, because you are in my house, and in my garden, and in my daughter's drawings, and I cannot keep pretending that I do not want to know who you are. It is not fair to me. It is not fair to Myrie. And if I am being honest, it is not fair to you, because whatever you are hiding, you are carrying it alone. And carrying things alone is something I know about, and it does not end well." She stopped, waited. Edward sat very still. He did not pick up his spoon. He did not touch his bread. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the candle, and Fiona watched the light play across his face and saw the war happening behind his eyes, the push and pull of the truth trying to get out, and the fear trying to keep it in. "My name is Edward Ashworth," he said. "That part is true." "What part is not true?" He closed his eyes, opened them, looked at her. "I am the 6th Duke of Linmore." The words landed on the kitchen table, like stones dropped from a height. Fiona heard them. She understood them individually. Duke, 6th, Lindmore. She understood what they meant when assembled into a sentence. She understood that the man sitting across from her, the man who ate her leftover chicken, and rebuilt her walls and planted her vegetables, and made her daughter a birdhouse shaped like her house, was not a gardener. He was a duke. She did not speak. She picked up her glass, drank, put it down, picked it up again, drank again, put it down. "A duke," she said. "Yes, an actual duke, with a title, and an estate, and a seat in the House of Lords." "Technically, yes. I have not attended the Lords. I have not been to the estate in 6 months. The title is not something I can return, although I have thought about it." Fiona stared at him. She stared at the boots. She stared at the shirt. She stared at the hands, which were rough and cracked from months of gardening, but which held a teacup by the handle and used a knife and fork with the practiced ease of someone who had dined at tables set with more silverware than Fiona owned. "The greenhouse glass," she said. "Yes." "The roof money." He hesitated. That was enough. "The anonymous donation. The Highlands Small Business Relief Fund. £5,000. That was you." "Yes." Fiona stood up. She did not know why she stood up. She just needed to not be sitting. She needed to be on her feet, because sitting felt like sinking, and sinking felt like the floor had opened up beneath her and everything she had built over the last 6 months. The trust, the arrangement, the careful, cautious, quiet thing between them that she had been tending like a seedling in a greenhouse, all of it was hanging over a gap. "You watched me," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. "You stood in my garden and watched me struggle with the money, and the roof, and the boiler, and the electricity bill. You watched me cry in the kitchen, over the repair quote. You watched me talk to the roses about whether I could afford to keep you on, and the whole time, you had more money than I will see in 10 lifetimes, and you helped me from behind a wall, literally behind a wall." Edward stood up too. "Fiona." "No, sit down, let me finish." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The quiet was more effective than volume. "I told you this was my house. I told you I make the decisions. And you agreed. You nodded. You went back to your stones. And then you called your solicitor and moved money around and arranged a donation that came dressed up as charity, so I would not know it was you. Because you knew I would not accept it from you. Because I told you I would not accept it. Because I looked you in the face and said no." She paused, breathed. "You decided what I needed. You decided how to give it. You decided I should not know. You made every decision for me while standing in my garden pretending to be something you are not. And the worst part is, it worked. The roof is fixed. The garden is beautiful. The business is growing. You fixed everything. You fixed everything by lying to me for 6 months." Edward's face had not moved. He was standing at the table with his hands at his sides, and his gray eyes fixed on her, and his mouth set in a line that was not defiance and was not surrender, but something in between. The expression of a man who had known this moment was coming, and had dreaded it, and had no defense prepared, because there was no defense. "I did not know how to be anyone else," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means that when I came here, I was not a duke. I was not anything. Catherine was dead, and everything I had been, every role, every identity, every version of myself that existed in relation to her, all of it was gone. I drove here because I needed to be somewhere that did not know me. I needed to do something that did not require me to be the person I was before. I needed to fix something, anything, a wall, a garden, something physical and broken, that I could repair with my hands, because I could not repair the thing that was actually broken, and fixing walls was the closest I could get." He stopped. He was breathing carefully, controlled, the way a person breathes when the alternative is not breathing at all. "I did not plan to stay. I did not plan to care about the garden or the house or the guests or the roof. I did not plan to sit at this table or eat your soup or watch your daughter grow up. I did not plan any of it. It happened. You happened. And by the time I understood what was happening, I was already too deep to tell you the truth without losing everything, and I was not ready to lose everything again." The kitchen was very quiet. The candle guttered. The stove ticked as it cooled. Outside, the Highland dark was absolute, the kind of dark that city people feared and country people ignored, and Fiona lived in, every night, alone, with her grief and her girl and her groaning house. "The roof money," she said. "I cried over that money, Edward. I stood in the garden and told the roses someone saved us, and you heard me. You heard me, and said nothing. I know. Why? Because you did not need saving. You needed the roof fixed. Those are different things. You would have found a way. You always find a way. The money just made it happen sooner. That is not your decision to make. I know that too." Fiona stood at the counter. Edward stood at the table. The kitchen between them was 10 feet wide and 6 months deep, and full of plates on steps, and plates on windowsills, and tea on walls, and biscuits through gaps, and a birdhouse that looked like a house, and a daughter who loved him, and a woman who was trying very hard to be angry, and was failing, because the anger was mixed with something else, something that tasted like relief, because the secret was out, and secrets are heavy, and she had been carrying the weight of not knowing, alongside the weight of everything else, and the not knowing was gone now, and the lightness of its absence was dizzying. "I do not care about the title," she said. He looked at her. "I do not care that you are a duke. I do not care about Lindmore Hall, or the House of Lords, or whatever else comes with being the sixth anything. I care that you lied. I care that you watched me struggle and helped from behind a wall. I care that you are here, and I did not know why." He held her gaze. "Do you know why now?" "I think so." "Does it matter?" "Yes." She picked up the plates, carried them to the sink, stood with her back to him. "I need time," she said. "I understand. I need to think about what this means. For the business. For Myri. For—" She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. "Take whatever time you need," he said. He put on his coat, stood in the doorway. The same doorway where he had stood on Christmas night. The same doorway where he had stood with the employment form. The same doorway where he stood every evening when she handed him his plate. The threshold between inside and outside, between her world and his, between the woman who ran a bed and breakfast and the man who was pretending to be a gardener, and the truth that had been standing between them, like a wall that neither of them had been willing to climb. "I am sorry," he said. She did not turn around. She heard the door close. She heard his footsteps on the path. She heard the cottage door open and close. She washed the dishes. She washed every dish. She washed the pot and the pan and the cutting board and the bread knife. She washed things that did not need washing. She dried them and put them away and wiped the counters and swept the floor. And when there was nothing left to clean, she sat at the table and put her head in her hands and sat there for a very long time. She was not angry. She should have been. She had every right to be. He had lied. He had manipulated. He had made decisions about her life without her knowledge or consent. He had done it from a place of care, which made it better, and from a place of privilege, which made it worse. But she was not angry. She was sad. She was sad because the gardener she had come to trust was someone else. She was sad because the someone else had been hurting and had come to her garden to heal, and she had not known. And the not knowing meant she had not been able to help, and she wanted to help. She wanted to help him the way he had helped her, with plates on steps and tea on walls, and the quiet, daily accumulation of presents. She was sad because Callum would have laughed. He would have thrown his head back and laughed until his eyes watered, and said something like, "Only you, Fiona. Only you could hire a duke to pull your weeds." And she would have laughed too, and the laughing would have made everything lighter, because Callum's laughter was like that. It was gravity reduction, it was load-bearing comedy, and it was gone, and she was here. And the man in the garden was not who she thought he was, and the world was doing the thing it always did, which was change shape when she was not looking. She went to bed. She did not sleep. She stared at the ceiling and listened to the house groan and thought about walls. The walls Edward had built, the walls she had built, the walls between them, the walls around each of them, all the walls. And she thought about what it meant to take a wall down, stone by stone, the way Edward had dismantled the broken ones, the way he had rebuilt them, carefully, patiently, one stone at a time. She closed her eyes. She would figure it out. She always figured it out. But tonight she was going to let it hurt. Fiona did not speak to Edward for 7 days. She left plates on his step. He left them on the windowsill. The system continued, because the system was older than the secret, older than the anger, older than the sadness. And Fiona was not the kind of woman who stopped feeding a person because she was furious with them. Fury and hospitality operated on separate circuits in her brain, and the hospitality circuit did not have an off switch. But she did not speak to him. She did not bring him tea in the garden. She did not stand in the kitchen doorway watching him work. She did not walk past the greenhouse or lean on the wall or say good morning or good evening or anything at all. She moved through the house on her own routes, and he moved through the garden on his, and the two routes did not cross, and the silence between them was not the comfortable silence of before. It was the silence of a wound that had not been dressed. Edward worked. He worked with the same methodical focus he had always shown, but Fiona could see, from the upstairs window, where she sometimes stood when she thought no one was looking, that the focus was different now. It was the focus of a man working to justify his presence, working to earn the right to stay, working because if he stopped working, there would be nothing between him and the possibility that she would ask him to leave. And leaving was the thing he feared most, because leaving meant going back to the life he had fled. The empty house, the empty title, the empty space where Catherine had been. Myri came home from her grandmother's on the Wednesday and noticed immediately. Children are seismographs for adult emotion. They do not understand the geology, but they feel the tremors. Myri felt them in the way her mother's shoulders sat higher than usual, in the way she held her coffee cup a little too tightly, in the way she talked about Edward without using his name, referring to him as the gardener, in a tone that was neutral in the way a country is neutral when it is surrounded by armies. "Is Edward okay?" Mary asked on Thursday morning, eating her cereal. "He is fine. He looks sad again." "He is fine, Mary. Did you have a fight?" "Adults do not fight. Adults do not fight." "Yes, they do. Hamish's parents fight all the time. He can hear them through the wall." Fiona put down her coffee cup. "Edward and I are not fighting. We are having a difference of understanding. It is not the same thing." Mary looked at her mother with the clear-eyed assessment of a child who had been lied to by adults enough times to recognize the particular flavor of a careful truth that was dressed up to look like the full truth, but was wearing someone else's clothes. "Can I still talk to him?" Mary asked. "Yes, of course you can." "Good. He promised to show me how to plant sweet peas." Myri finished her cereal and went outside, and within 10 minutes, she was at the garden wall, chin propped on the stones, chattering about school and Hamish's worm-related offenses, and the blue tits in the birdhouse. Edward listened. He crouched by the wall and listened to every word, and Fiona stood at the kitchen window and watched them, and the watching was painful in a way she had not expected, because what she saw was a man who loved her daughter without complication or condition or agenda, who loved her daughter the way a good person loves a child, with patience and attention, and the willingness to take sweet pea seeds seriously. And she saw, standing at that window, that the thing she was angry about was not the lying, or the money, or the title. It was the distance. He had kept himself at a distance while closing every other distance, and the asymmetry of it, the fact that he knew her completely, and she did not know him at all, was the thing that hurt. Not the secret itself, the loneliness of not being trusted with it. On the 7th day, she went to the garden. He was at the greenhouse, his back to her, repotting tomato seedlings into larger containers. She stood behind him for a moment, watching his hands in the soil. His hands had changed since October. They were rougher now, calloused, tanned, the hands of a man who worked with them every day. The nails were clipped short and had a permanent crescent of soil beneath them. They were not the hands of a duke, they were the hands of a gardener. And it occurred to Fiona, standing behind him in the greenhouse he had rebuilt, that perhaps the two things were not as different as she had assumed. Perhaps a person could be both. Perhaps identity was not a wall but a garden, with different things growing in different seasons, and the task was not to choose which one was real, but to tend all of them. "Edward," she said. He turned. He looked at her, the way a person looks at an approaching storm, with attention and respect, and the readiness to be hit by whatever comes. "I have been thinking," she said. "I know. I have been thinking for 7 days, which is 5 days longer than I have ever thought about anything that was not a plumbing emergency or a tax deadline, so I would appreciate it if you would listen, because I do not want to think about this for an 8th day." He set down the seedling, wiped his hands on his trousers, stood facing her. "You lied to me," she said. "Not about your name, not about being a gardener. You lied about who you are. You let me believe you were someone without resources, someone passing through, someone who needed this job the way I needed this house. You let me believe we were the same, that we were both holding on by our fingernails. And we were not the same, Edward. You had a safety net the size of a county, and I had nothing, and you chose not to tell me." He did not speak. He stood and took it. "The roof money. I cannot get past the roof money, not because you gave it, because I cried, Edward. I cried at that kitchen table over a number I could not meet. And you could have written a check. You could have fixed it in 5 minutes. Instead, you arranged an anonymous donation through a charity and let me think the universe had sent a miracle, and I was grateful. I was so grateful, and the gratitude was for something you manufactured. It was not a miracle. It was a bank transfer. She paused, breathed. But here is the thing. Here is the part I have been stuck on for 7 days. You were right. He blinked. He had not expected that. You were right that I would not have accepted it from you. You were right that I would have said no. You were right that I would have chosen the bank loan with the terrible interest rate and the slow slide into debt over accepting money from my gardener. Because my pride is a structural problem, Edward. It is load-bearing, and if I removed it, the whole thing might fall down. And you knew that. You knew me well enough to know that, which means you were paying attention, which means you cared, and I cannot be angry at someone for caring about me in the wrong way, when the right way would not have worked. She stopped. The greenhouse was warm. The glass caught the morning light and held it, and the air smelled like soil and green things growing, and the particular brand of tension that exists between two people who are about to decide whether to move closer or further apart.
I am not angry,
she said.
I was. I am not anymore.
I am hurt, and the hurt is going to take longer than 7 days, but I am not asking you to leave. I am asking you to stay, and I am asking you to stop lying about everything. No more walls. I have enough walls in this house without you building invisible ones between us. Edward looked at her, and then he did something Fiona had not seen before, something that broke through every barrier and every defense and every careful, cultivated distance he had maintained for 6 months. He told her the truth. Not the headline truth, not, I am a duke. The real truth, the underneath truth. The truth that lived in the pauses and the silences and the face-down photographs. Catherine and I tried to have children, he said, for 4 years. It did not happen. We saw specialists, we did treatments. Nothing worked. And then she was diagnosed, and the treatment stopped, and the trying stopped, and everything stopped except the waiting. 14 months of waiting. I held her hand every day. I read to her. I brought her flowers from the garden at Linmore, because the garden was the thing she loved most, more than the house, more than the title, more than any of it. She loved watching things grow. He stopped. His jaw was tight. His hands were at his sides, and Fiona could see them trembling, not from cold. When she died, the house became a tomb. Every room was a room she had been in. Every corridor was a corridor she had walked. The garden was impossible. I could not look at it. Every flower she had planted was a reminder that she was not there to see it, and every new growth was an insult, because the garden kept going, and she did not. So I left. I drove until I could not drive anymore, and I ended up here. And I fixed your wall because your wall was broken, and mine was not fixable. He looked at the greenhouse, the panes of glass he had fitted, the shelves he had built. I rebuilt your greenhouse because Catherine would have loved it. Every seed I planted, every wall I repaired, every task I finished, I did it for her, because I could not build her a garden anymore. So I built you one. Fiona stood in the greenhouse and listened and did not move and did not speak and did not breathe, and felt everything, rush through her like a river that had been dammed and was now released, and the river was grief and love and recognition, and the terrible, beautiful knowledge that the man standing in front of her was not a liar. He was a widower who had found the only way he knew to keep his wife alive, which was to grow things in her name and give them to strangers and pretend it was his job. She did not cry. She had spent 4 years learning not to cry at the wrong moment, learning to hold it, to let it pass, to save it for 2 in the morning when Myri was asleep, and the house was dark, and the only witness was the crack in the plaster above the stove. She reached out. She put her hand on his arm. He flinched, not away from her, inward, the flinch of a person who has been touched for the first time in months, who has forgotten what it feels like to be reached for instead of reaching, who has built every wall he knows how to build and is watching someone walk through them as if they were not there. Edward, she said, look at me. He looked at her. You do not need to build gardens for ghosts. You can build them for people who are here. He looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at her face. He looked at the greenhouse around them, the glass and the light and the green and the growth, all of it his work, all of it his gift, all of it offered in the name of someone who was gone, to someone who was here. I know, he said. They stood in the greenhouse, Fiona's hand on his arm, his eyes on hers. The morning light through the glass, the seedlings on the shelves, the world outside doing its usual Highland thing, which was being gray and cold and indifferent to the small dramas of the humans who lived in it. Then Fiona let go. She stepped back. Right, she said. I need to make breakfast. The Hendersons are back. Mr. Henderson wants kippers, which means the whole kitchen will smell like fish for 3 days, and I will have to air the dining room with both windows open, which means the room will be freezing, which means Mrs. Henderson will complain about the draft, which means I will apologize while silently blaming her husband's breakfast choices. This is my life, Edward. This is the empire you have infiltrated. He looked at her. She looked at him. And the thing that happened between them was not a kiss, and not a declaration, and not any of the things that happen in stories when the truth comes out. It was something smaller and more important. It was recognition, the mutual, wordless acknowledgement that they were standing on the same ground, at last, with the same weight, at last, and that whatever came next would come honestly. Fiona went inside. Edward went back to his seedlings. Mary appeared at the greenhouse door 10 minutes later. Did you and Mum make up? She asked. I think so. Good. Can we plant the sweet peas now? Yes. Excellent. They planted sweet peas along the south wall, in the warmest spot in the garden, where the light lasted longest, and the soil was richest, and the climbing roses had been trained to share the wall instead of dominating it. Mary planted each seed with the concentrated seriousness of a surgeon and the spatial awareness of a drunk bee, which meant Edward had to covertly respace the seeds when she was not looking. She did not notice. She was too busy narrating. These ones are going to be pink, she announced. I have decided. Sweet peas come in many colors. You cannot decide for them. I can encourage them. That is not how botany works. It is how optimism works, and my mum says optimism is just as important. Edward looked at this child, this small, fierce, freckled person who said things that landed in his chest like stones in a garden, and he felt something open that had been closed for a very long time. A door he had bricked up with grief and sealed with silence, and walked past every day pretending it was a wall. It was not a wall, it was a door, and Myri had knocked on it every day since October, with biscuits and questions and drawings, and the door was opening now, not because he had decided to open it, but because some doors open on their own when the person on the other side is patient enough, and stubborn enough, and kind enough to keep knocking. Your mother is right, he said. Optimism is important. Are you an optimist, Edward? He looked at the garden, at the walls, at the greenhouse, at the house where a woman was making kippers for a man who did not know they would smell for 3 days. I am becoming one, he said. Mary grinned her gap-toothed grin. Good. Pessimists are boring. My mum says that too. Your mum says a lot of things. She talks to the roses. Did you know that? I have heard her, yes. She thinks nobody hears her. But I hear her. And you hear her. Myri patted the soil over the last seed. That means we are the only people who really know her. You and me. Edward sat in the garden with this 8-year-old girl and felt the weight of what she had said settle on him like sunlight. Warm and gentle, and impossible to push away. She was right. He and Myri were the only people who really knew Fiona, the woman who talked to roses, the woman who burned toast, the woman who carried a stone in her pocket for a husband who drowned, the woman who ran a falling-apart empire with stubborn grace, and who had just stood in a greenhouse and forgiven a duke for lying about everything except the thing that mattered, which was that he cared. He cared about the garden, and the house, and the child, and, most of all, about the woman who burned the toast. He cared, and caring was terrifying. Caring was the thing that broke you. Caring was what made Catherine's death unbearable, because if he had not cared, the loss would have been manageable, and if the loss had been manageable, he would not have driven 9 hours to a village he had never heard of, and taken a job he did not need, and fallen in love with a life that was not his. Fallen in love. He sat with those words. He sat with them the way Fiona sat with the electricity bill, staring at a number that was too large, doing the mathematics, checking it twice, 3 times, and arriving at the same answer every time. He was in love with Fiona Lennox. He was in love with the way she burned toast and argued with hydrangeas, and paid him in cash, and left plates on his step, and raised her daughter alone in a groaning house, and refused to ask for help, and talk to roses, because roses were the only things that listened without judging, and because talking to roses was easier than admitting that she needed a person, a real live person, to listen instead. He was in love with all of it, every imperfect, stubborn, magnificent piece. He finished planting the sweet peas. He walked to the cottage. He sat at the table and looked at Mary's drawing on the wall, 2 stick figures in a garden, and he did not look at the drawer where Catherine's photograph lay. He did not need to. Catherine was not in the drawer. Catherine was in the garden. In every stone, every seed, every pane of glass. She was in the soil, and the light, and the growth, and she always would be, and that was not a burden. It was a gift. He went to bed. He slept through the night. In the house, Fiona cleaned the kitchen. The kipper smell was already establishing itself as a territorial presence. She opened both dining room windows. She thought about the greenhouse. She thought about Edward's hands trembling. She thought about Catherine, a woman she had never met, a woman who loved gardens, a woman who died. She thought about Callum. She thought about what he would say. She heard him, clearly, as if he were standing in the kitchen beside her, his voice warm and teasing, and full of the love that had not diminished in 4 years of absence. For the love of all that is holy, Fiona. Just kiss the man. He rebuilt your greenhouse. She smiled. It was a real smile, not a tired one, or a brave one, or a performing for guests one. A real one. She turned off the lights. She went to bed. She did not talk to the roses. She did not need to. May arrived, and with it, the first guests who had booked specifically because of the garden. They came in couples and in groups. They came from Edinburgh and Glasgow and London, and, once, from Copenhagen. They brought cameras and notebooks and walking boots, and the particular brand of urban exhaustion that made them look at the Highland sky with the wide-eyed wonder of prisoners released into daylight. They photographed the roses. They photographed the greenhouse. They photographed the stone walls and the vegetable patch, and the sweet peas, which were climbing the south wall with the manic energy of plants that had decided to prove Myri's optimism correct. The sweet peas were pink, every single one. Myri was insufferable about it. "I told you," she said to Edward, hands on hips, standing in front of the south wall like a general reviewing her troops. "I said they would be pink, and they are pink." "Sweet peas have a natural tendency toward the pink spectrum," Edward said. "It is not unusual. It is optimism. It is genetics. Same thing." Edward did not argue. He had learned, over 8 months, that arguing with Mary was like arguing with weather. You could disagree with it all you wanted. It was going to do what it was going to do. The bookings brought money, real money, not the trickle that Fiona had been surviving on, the anxious arithmetic of rooms sold against rooms empty, the constant calculation of whether this month would break even or break her. This was a current. A steady flowing current of income that allowed her to do something she had not done in 4 years. She stopped worrying. Not entirely. Fiona was constitutionally incapable of not worrying, the way some people are constitutionally incapable of not humming in the shower or not reading the back of cereal boxes. Worrying was her operating system, but the frequency changed, the volume dropped. The worry that had been a constant, screaming alarm in the back of her mind faded to a background hum, still there, still present, but no longer the dominant sound. She hired a second employee, a young man from the village named Colin Bain, who was 19 and studying part-time, and who could fix anything electronic, which made him, in Fiona's estimation, more useful than a doctor. Colin sorted the Wi-Fi. Colin fixed the booking system. Colin set up an automated email response for inquiries, which meant Fiona no longer had to answer 14 messages a day manually, a task that had been eating 2 hours of every morning and making her seriously consider becoming a hermit. The business was growing. Briarstone House was becoming something, not the crumbling, leaking, groaning monument to stubbornness that it had been when Edward arrived. Something real, something viable, something that could sustain itself and sustain her and sustain Myri. and provide a life that was not held together by sheer willpower, and the hope that the boiler would make it through one more winter. And Edward was still there. He was still in the garden, still in the greenhouse, still at the cottage, but the terms had changed. Since the dinner, since the truth, since the greenhouse, the terms had changed in ways that were subtle and fundamental, the way a key change in a song alters everything without altering the notes. He ate dinner at the house now, not every night, but 3 or 4 nights a week. He would knock on the kitchen door at 6, and Fiona would let him in, and they would eat at the table with Myri, the 3 of them, and the conversation would flow with the easy, imperfect rhythm of people who were no longer pretending, who had laid their cards on the table and were playing with open hands. He told her about Lindmore, not all at once, in pieces, the way he told everything, carefully, stone by stone. The house was Jacobean, built in 1623, 17 bedrooms, 12 bathrooms, a library with 4,000 books, a gallery with family portraits going back to the first Duke, who had been a soldier in the English Civil War and had chosen the winning side at exactly the right moment, which was, Edward said, the primary qualification for aristocracy. The estate was 9,000 acres, farmland, woodland, a river, a village, tenant cottages, a home farm, a church, the kind of land that had been held by one family for 400 years and that carried, along with its beauty, the weight of 400 years of expectation, tradition, and the unspoken obligation to keep it going, to maintain it, to pass it on, to be worthy of it. Edward's father had been the 5th Duke, a quiet man, a good man, by Edward's account, the kind of man who took his responsibilities seriously and his pleasures modestly, and who died at 62 of a heart attack on the front steps of the house, as if even in death he was unwilling to make a scene indoors. Edward had inherited the title at 27. He had been working in London at the time, in a job he did not describe, and had returned to Lindmore with the reluctant acceptance of a man who understood that duty was not optional, that the house and the land and the people who depended on them were now his responsibility, and that walking away was not something the 6th in a line of 6 had the right to do. He had met Catherine at a charity event 2 years later. She was the daughter of a diplomat. She was organized. She was capable. She was, Edward said, the kind of person who walked into a room and made the room work better simply by being in it. She had taken to Lindmore the way some people take to languages, naturally and completely, as if she had been speaking it all her life. They had been happy. He said this simply, without elaboration, and Fiona understood that the simplicity was the point, that happiness does not need footnotes, that the fact of it was sufficient. Then the illness, then the treatments, then the decline, then the end. He told Fiona all of this over the course of 3 weeks, in the evenings, at the kitchen table, while Myri did homework or drew pictures or watched cartoons in the sitting room. He told it without drama and without self-pity and without the performance of grief that some people adopt when they talk about loss, the rehearsed sadness that is more about the speaker than the subject. He told it like a gardener describes a season. This is what grew. This is what died. This is what was left. Fiona listened. She listened the way she did everything, with total attention and minimal interruption, and she asked questions only when the silence grew too long, only when she could see him getting stuck in the memory, sinking into it the way a boot sinks into mud, and her questions were always the same kind, practical, concrete, anchoring him to the present. What was her favorite flower? Peonies. She grew them along the south terrace. And yours? I did not have a favorite before. Now I think it is sweet peas. He looked at her when he said it. She looked at him. The candle between them guttered in a draft from the window she had not fixed yet. They did not kiss. They did not touch. But the distance between them was no longer the width of a secret. It was the width of a table. And the table had food on it. And the food was shared. Fiona's mother visited in late May. Margaret Lennox was 63, sharp-tongued, warm-hearted, and constitutionally incapable of minding her own business. She arrived from Inverness in a small car, packed with gifts for Myri, opinions about the house, and a radar for emotional undercurrents that would have made military intelligence envious. She spotted Edward within the first hour. "Who is that?" she asked, standing at the kitchen window, watching him prune the apple trees. The gardener, Fiona said. That is not a gardener. That is a man with a secret. Mother. I have eyes, Fiona. That man has breeding. Look at the way he stands. Look at the shoes. Look at the way he holds those secateurs. That is a man who went to a school with a Latin motto. Fiona opened her mouth to deny it, and then closed it, because her mother was right, and lying to Margaret Lennox was both futile and exhausting. His name is Edward. He is complicated. All the interesting ones are. He is not. We are not. It is not like that. Margaret looked at her daughter. The look contained 40 years of motherhood, 20 years of marriage, the experience of losing a son-in-law to the sea, and the bone-deep knowledge that her daughter was lying. Fiona. Sweetheart, I carried you for 9 months. I taught you to walk. I held you when Callum died. I know what your face looks like when you are in love, and I know what your face looks like when you are pretending not to be. You are doing the second one right now. I am making tea. You are making tea while pretending not to be in love, which is a very specific thing I have seen you do before. Because you did it for 3 months with Callum, before you finally admitted it, and that time, you burned a hole in a tablecloth because you were so distracted. Fiona slammed the kettle down. I am not burning anything. You burn the toast every morning. That is unrelated. Margaret sat at the kitchen table. She folded her hands. She had the patience of a woman who had been waiting for her daughter to be happy again for 4 years, and was not going to be put off by denial. Tell me about him, she said. Fiona stood at the counter with the kettle boiling behind her, and her mother in front of her, and the truth pressing against her teeth like water against a dam, and she held it for approximately 4 seconds before it broke through. She told her everything: the newspaper ad, the cottage, the walls, the greenhouse, the boots, the teacup, the biscuits through the wall, the storm and the roof and the tarpaulin, the anonymous donation, the employment form, the dinner, the greenhouse confession, the 7 days of silence, the sweet peas, the Duke. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Fiona finished, Margaret picked up her tea, took a sip, set it down, and said, I like him. You do not know him. I know enough. He rebuilt your walls. He climbed your roof in a storm. He fixed your greenhouse. He planted your daughter sweet peas. And he told you the truth when he could have kept lying. That is enough. He is a duke, mother. I do not care if he is the Pope. He makes my granddaughter happy, and he makes my daughter look like a person who remembers what being alive feels like. That is worth more than any title. Fiona sat down. She put her head in her hands. She laughed, and the laugh was tired and relieved and slightly hysterical, and Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You are allowed to be happy, Fiona. Callum would want that. You know he would. I know. Then stop burning the toast and go talk to the man. Fiona looked at her mother. Margaret looked back with the serene confidence of a woman who had said what needed to be said and was content to wait for the result. Fiona went outside. Edward was in the greenhouse. Of course he was in the greenhouse. He was always in the greenhouse when things were about to change, as if the glass and the light and the growing things made difficult conversations easier, as if the act of being surrounded by life made it safer to talk about living. She stood in the doorway. He turned. My mother is here, Fiona said. I saw the car. She knows. About the title. He went very still. She said she likes you. He blinked. She does not know me. She knows you climbed my roof in a storm. That was sufficient. He looked at her. She looked at him. The distance between them was the length of the greenhouse, 12 feet of warm air, and potted tomatoes, and the accumulated weight of 8 months of proximity and restraint. Edward, she said, I am going to say something, and I need you to not say anything until I have finished, because if you say something in the middle, I will lose my nerve, and losing my nerve is not something I can afford, because I have already lost my husband, and my financial stability, and my ability to make toast, and I am not losing my nerve on top of all that. He nodded. He did not speak. I am in love with you. I have been in love with you since Christmas, and possibly before that, and definitely since the greenhouse, and I have been telling the roses about it, because the roses do not talk back, and I was not ready for someone to talk back. But I am ready now. I am terrified. But I am ready. Because Callum taught me that being terrified and being ready are not mutually exclusive, and my mother just told me I am allowed to be happy. And Mary told me months ago that you look at me the way her father looked at me in photographs. And if an 8-year-old and a 63-year-old both agree on something, the statistical probability of them being wrong is very low. She stopped. She was breathing harder than she wanted to be. Her hands were at her sides. Her chin was up. She looked like a woman who had just jumped off a cliff and was waiting to find out if the water below was deep enough. Edward crossed the greenhouse. He stopped in front of her. He was close enough that she could see the flecks of green in his gray eyes, the soil on his collar, the small scar above his eyebrow, that she had never asked about, and probably never would, because some things did not need stories. They just needed to exist. I look at you that way because I am in love with you, he said. I have been in love with you since you threatened a hydrangea with eviction, possibly before that. Certainly since the Kipper complaint. I did not tell you, because I did not trust myself to love someone again, without the love becoming a dependency. And I had already depended on Catherine for everything. And when she died, the dependency did not die with her. It became a void. And I was afraid that loving you would fill the void, and then losing you would create a new one. And I was not sure I could survive another void. He paused. But I am tired of building walls to keep the void out. And your daughter told me optimism is the same as genetics, and I am choosing to believe her, because she is the wisest person I have ever met, and she is 8, and I think the world would be a better place if we listened to 8-year-olds more often. Fiona laughed. It was a wet laugh, the kind that comes with tears that are not sad. She reached up and put her hand on his face. He leaned into it. She felt the warmth of his skin, and the roughness of his jaw, and the tremor in his breathing, and the years of loneliness, and the months of proximity, and the weight of two people who had both lost someone and had found, in the ruins of that loss, a garden. She kissed him. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was not the kind of kiss that stops time or starts music or changes the light. It was a careful kiss, a first kiss. The kind of kiss between two people who are out of practice, who have forgotten the choreography, who are navigating the space between one mouth and another, with the hesitant precision of people relearning a language they once spoke fluently. It lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then Fiona stepped back. She wiped her eyes. She straightened her jumper. Right, she said. My mother is in the kitchen. She will want to interrogate you. She will ask about the estate and the title and your intentions and whether you can cook, because she believes any man who cannot cook is a liability. She will also ask if you voted Conservative, and the correct answer, regardless of truth, is no. Edward looked at her. The ghost was gone. In its place was something that Fiona had never seen on his face before. Something that was not a smile, and not a grin, but something bigger and more reckless. Something that looked like a man who had been standing in the dark for a very long time, and had just walked into the light, and was letting it hit him full in the face. I can cook, he said. That is a good start. They walked into the house together. Margaret was at the kitchen table, pretending to read a magazine, fooling no one. She looked up. She looked at Fiona's face. She looked at Edward's face. Tea? She said. Please, Edward said. Margaret stood up and put the kettle on, and Fiona burned the toast, and Edward sat at the kitchen table in a house that was not his, in a life that was not planned, beside a woman who talked to roses, and a woman who saw through walls, and he felt, for the first time since Catherine, that the world was a place where things could grow. The kettle boiled, the toast burned. Myri ran in from the garden with soil on her knees and a fistful of pink sweet peas, and the announcement that the Blue Tits had babies and that she had named all of them, and the kitchen was loud and warm and chaotic and alive, and Edward sat in the middle of it and let it wash over him like rain. Good rain. The kind that makes things grow. The press found out in July. It was inevitable. A duke does not disappear for 9 months without leaving a trail. And Edward's trail, while carefully obscured, was not invisible. His solicitor knew where he was. His estate manager knew he was alive, if not precisely where. His mother, Lady Constance Ashworth, knew he was in Scotland because he had called her in May, after the greenhouse conversation, to tell her he was safe, and that he was staying, and that she should stop telephoning Philip Hartwell every Monday morning to demand updates. The leak came from a guest, a woman named Penelope Caird, who had stayed at Briarstone for 3 nights in late June, and who had taken approximately 200 photographs during her visit, including several of Edward working in the garden. She had posted them on social media with the caption, "The most enchanting B&B in the Highlands, tended by the most mysterious gardener I have ever seen." A journalist at a tabloid in London saw the photographs. The journalist recognized Edward. The journalist had covered Catherine's funeral 8 months earlier and had filed the photograph in the vast, organized archive of public faces that tabloid journalists maintain the way squirrels maintain nut caches, against the possibility of future use. The journalist called Briarstone House. Fiona answered the phone. "Hello, Briarstone House. How can I help you?" "Good morning. This is Oliver Keane from the Daily Courier. I am looking into a story about a member of the British aristocracy who may be working at your establishment. I wondered if you could confirm whether the Duke of Lindmore is currently employed as your gardener." Fiona held the phone. She held it the way you hold a live thing that might bite, carefully, at a distance, with the awareness that what happens next depends entirely on what you do with your hands. "I am sorry," she said. "I do not discuss my staff with the press." "So you do have staff that might be of interest." "I have a gardener. He is very good at his job. That is the extent of what I will say." "Mrs. Lennox, the Duke of Lindmore has been missing from public life for 9 months. His family has been concerned. There is significant public interest." "There may be public interest, but there is no public entitlement. Thank you for calling. Goodbye." She hung up. She stood in the hallway with the phone in her hand, and her heart hammering, and a cold, spreading sensation in her stomach that she recognized from the morning the fishing company had called about Callum. The sensation of a life about to be disrupted by a force she could not control. She found Edward in the greenhouse. She told him. He went still. The same stillness she had seen on the night she held up the employment form. The night he told her the truth. The stillness of a man calculating impact, measuring distance, planning exits. "How long?" he asked. "Until they run the story? A day. Maybe 2. They will try to confirm. They will call the estate. They will call Philip. They will send someone to photograph the house. They will come here. Yes." He looked at the seedlings on the shelf. He looked at the glass ceiling. He looked at the walls he had built, and the garden he had planted, and the life he had constructed, piece by piece, in this small corner of Scotland. And Fiona could see him thinking about running. She could see the thought cross his face like a shadow crossing a field, the old reflex, the instinct to disappear, to drive until the name could not follow, to find another village, and another pub, and another board with another ad. "Do not run," she said. He looked at her. "I know that face," she said. "That is the face of a man calculating how long it takes to get to his car. I saw it the night I confronted you. I see it now. Do not run. If they come here, they will not leave you alone. They will camp outside. They will take photographs. They will interview your guests. They will write about Mairie. They will not write about Mairie. They will try. They will try, and they will fail. Because I am a Scottish woman who has survived widowhood, bankruptcy, roof collapse, and a teal shower curtain controversy, and I am not going to be intimidated by a man named Oliver Keane from the Daily Courier." Edward looked at her. She stood in the greenhouse doorway with her arms crossed, and her jaw set, and the particular expression that he had come to recognize as Fiona preparing to fight something, an expression he had previously seen deployed against hydrangeas, electricity bills, leaking roofs, and the Wi-Fi router. It was the expression of a woman who had been knocked down enough times to know that getting up was not optional. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to do nothing. I want to carry on. I want to make breakfast and clean rooms and tend the garden and live my life. And if the Daily Courier wants to send someone to Craigenmore to watch a man prune roses, they are welcome to waste their time. It will not be one journalist. It will be several, and they will not just watch. Then we will deal with them when they arrive. Together." He heard the word, together. He heard it the way a person hears a note in a song that changes the key, the small, pivotal sound that shifts everything that follows. "Together," he repeated. "Yes, together. Is that a problem?" No, it is the opposite of a problem. She held his gaze. He held hers. The greenhouse hummed with the sound of things growing. They arrived on Thursday. 2 cars, 1 van, a photographer, a reporter, and a cameraman from a tabloid television program that Fiona had never watched and intended never to watch. They parked on the road outside Briarstone House and set up with the practiced efficiency of people who did this for a living, which they did, and who saw no issue with staking out a bed and breakfast in the Scottish Highlands to photograph a bereaved man who had been pulling weeds, which they did not. Fiona called the police, not because she expected them to do anything, but because she wanted a record, and because the police constable for the Craigenhore area, a man named Ian McPhee, was the kind of officer who took a dim view of trespassers and an even dimmer view of English tabloids. Constable McPhee arrived within the hour. He spoke to the journalists. He informed them that the road was public but the property was private, and that any attempt to enter the grounds without permission would be treated as trespass. He also informed them that the nearest pub served an excellent pie, and that they were welcome to wait there if they intended to persist, which he recommended against, because the weather forecast called for rain, and the road flooded in heavy rain, and he would not be sending anyone to tow their van out of a ditch. The journalists moved to the pub. They did not leave. They waited. Edward did not go into the garden that day. He sat in the kitchen with Fiona and Mary, who had been told, in age-appropriate terms, that some people from London wanted to take photographs of Edward because he was famous, and that the appropriate response to fame was to carry on as normal and not engage. "Why is he famous?" Mary asked. "Because his family has a big house," Fiona said. "Bigger than ours?" "Much bigger." "How many bedrooms?" 17. Mary's eyes widened. "That is too many bedrooms." "I agree." "Does the house have a garden?" Fiona looked at Edward. Edward looked at Mary. "It has a very large garden," he said, "with peonies and a maze and a lake." "A lake?" "A small lake." Mary processed this information with the methodical intensity she brought to all new data. "Does it have a birdhouse?" Edward smiled. Not the ghost, not the almost smile, the real one. The one Fiona had seen once before, on the morning Simon Fletcher saw his golden eagle, the one that changed his whole face, and did something to her chest that she had stopped trying to resist. "It does not have a birdhouse," he said. "Then our garden is better," Mary said. She went back to her drawing. The adults sat at the table and drank tea and listened to the rain begin, right on schedule, and Fiona thought about walls and gardens and the strange, terrible, wonderful fact that the man sitting across from her had 17 bedrooms and a lake, and had chosen, freely, deliberately, and with full knowledge of what he was leaving behind, to live in a cottage with a sagging mattress and a 2-burner stove and a rug that was more thread than fabric, because this was where the birdhouse was, and the sweet peas, and the blue tits, and the woman who burned toast. The tabloid ran the story on Friday. The headline was, "Duke Trades Manor for Mud." There was a photograph of Briarstone House that made it look smaller and more run down than it was. There was a photograph of Edward in the garden, taken from the road with a long lens, that made him look both startled and unkempt, which was unfair, because he was neither. There was a paragraph about Catherine's death. There was a paragraph about the Lindmore estate. There was a speculation about a romantic connection with the B&B's owner, which was based on nothing except the journalist's assumption that a man and a woman in proximity must be romantically involved, an assumption that happened to be correct, but was still an assumption. Fiona read the article on her phone. She read it once. She put the phone down. She picked it up. She read it again. She put it down. "They got the name of the house wrong," she said. "They called it Briarwood House." "They also said I was the 7th Duke," Edward said. "I am the 6th. And the photograph makes the garden look terrible. You cannot even see the greenhouse. The angle is wrong. They were shooting from the road." "They were shooting from the road because Constable McPhee would not let them on the property, which I appreciate, but the result is that my business looks like a shack and your garden looks like a wasteland, and the only people who are going to read this article are people who were not going to book a holiday in the Highlands anyway, so the entire exercise is pointless." She was ranting. She knew she was ranting. The ranting was a defense mechanism. A way of processing the invasion of her privacy by channeling the distress into complaints about photography angles and house names, because if she focused on the details, she could avoid focusing on the big thing, which was that her life was now public, her home was now a story, and the quiet, private, imperfect world she had built was now visible to anyone with a phone and a tabloid app. Edward reached across the table and took her hand. She stopped ranting. She looked at his hand on hers, his rough, soil-stained, calloused hand on her smooth, kitchen-worn, flour-dusted hand. The gardener and the innkeeper, the duke and the widow, the man who ran from a mansion and the woman who fought for a bed and breakfast. It will pass, he said. I know. They will move on to the next story. I know. And when they do, we will still be here. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Mary, who was drawing at the other end of the table and missing nothing, drew a picture of two hands holding each other across a table and pinned it to the fridge next to the birdhouse, drawing without commentary. The story did pass. It took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of journalists calling and Fiona hanging up. 2 weeks of photographers on the road and Constable McPhee moving them along. 2 weeks of online comments, some kind, some cruel, all irrelevant. 2 weeks of Edward staying inside, out of sight, out of range, eating at the kitchen table with Fiona and Mary while the world outside tried to turn his life into content. During those 2 weeks, something else happened. Something the journalists did not photograph, and the tabloids did not report, and the online commentators did not know about. Edward called his mother. He sat in the cottage, on the sagging bed, with the phone he had retrieved from his car, and he called Lady Constance Ashworth, and he talked to her for 2 hours. He told her about Briarstone. He told her about the garden. He told her about Fiona. He told her about Mary. He told her about the sweet peas and the birdhouse, and the roses and the toast. His mother cried, not with sadness, with relief. The relief of a woman who had lost her daughter-in-law and then her son, not to death but to something she could not reach, something she could not fix, something she had watched consume him like a frost consuming a garden, killing everything green. Bring them to Lindmore, she said. Not yet. When? When the time is right. Edward, darling, the time has been right for months. You are simply stalling because you are terrified, and being terrified is understandable, but it is also annoying, and I am your mother, so I am allowed to find it annoying. He laughed. His mother heard him laugh, and the sound made her cry again, because she had not heard him laugh in over a year, and laughter from a grieving child is the most hopeful sound a parent can hear. Soon, he said, I promise. I will hold you to that. I know you will. He hung up. He sat in the cottage and looked at Mary's drawing on the wall and the empty space on the table, where Catherine's photograph used to sit, and the window through which he could see the garden, his garden, the garden he had built from ruins, and he thought about soon, and what soon meant, and what came after soon. The journalists left, the road emptied, the story moved on to a politician's expense scandal, which was more interesting to the public than a duke who gardened, because politicians were supposed to be dishonest, and dukes were supposed to be eccentric, and neither story had anywhere to go. Briarstone House returned to itself. Guests came. Guests left. The roses bloomed. The vegetables grew. The blue tits in the birdhouse raised their babies and sent them into the world, which Mary narrated daily, with the emotional investment of a nature documentary presenter. And Fiona and Edward, in the evenings, at the kitchen table, with the candle and the tea, and the burned toast, and the crack in the plaster above the stove, continued the slow, careful, terrifying work of building something new from the pieces of something old. They did not rush. They had both learned, through loss, that rushing was a luxury of people who had not yet discovered how quickly things could end. They moved at the pace of a garden, seasonal, patient, attentive to what needed light, and what needed shade, and what needed time. Fiona told the roses less, not because she had less to say, but because she had someone to say it to. Edward slept through the night, every night. The sagging mattress no longer felt like a penance. It felt like a choice. And Mary, wise beyond her years and relentless in her observations, told them both, over breakfast one morning in August, that they were the happiest people she knew, and that she was going to draw a picture of them being happy. and that the picture was going to go on the fridge, and that the fridge was going to need a bigger door. She was not wrong about any of it. Edward did not reclaim his title for another 2 years. The decision was not dramatic. There was no single moment, no revelation, no grand gesture. It happened the way most important decisions happen, gradually, through the accumulation of small certainties, each one a stone in a wall, that eventually became strong enough to hold the weight of everything he had been avoiding. The first certainty was Mary. She was 9 by then, nearly 10, and she had grown in the way that children grow when they are loved by enough people, which is to say she had grown in every direction at once, taller and louder and more opinionated, and more compassionate, and more infuriating, and more wonderful with every passing month. She had her father's freckles, and her mother's stubbornness, and a vocabulary that she deployed with the precision of someone who had been raised by a woman who argued with plants, and a man who could name every species in a garden. She called Edward by his name. She had never called him anything else, not Dad, not Father, not Mr. Ashworth. She called him Edward, and the name in her mouth was its own kind of title, conferred not by birth or history or law but by the simple, irrevocable fact that she had chosen him, the way she had chosen the pink sweet peas, through optimism and will, and the absolute refusal to accept that things might not turn out the way she wanted. The second certainty was the house. Briarstone was thriving, not just surviving, thriving, the kind of thriving that meant waiting lists and 5-star reviews, and a feature in a national Sunday magazine that described the property as Scotland's best-kept secret, tended by a gardener with the touch of an artist and an owner with the heart of a general. Fiona had framed the article. She had hung it in the hallway, next to the tabloid headline, Duke Trades Manor for Mud, which she had framed first, because Fiona's sense of humor was dark, and her sense of irony was darker. The business supported 3 employees now. Helen, who ran the rooms with military efficiency. Colin, who had graduated from Wi-Fi repair to full-time manager of the booking system and website, and a woman named Nora Grant, who cooked breakfasts with the calm authority of someone who had never burned toast in her life, which Fiona found both admirable and slightly suspicious. The garden was the heart of it. Every guest who came to Briarstone came for the garden. They walked its paths, and sat on its benches, and photographed its roses, and its greenhouse, and its walls, and they left reviews that described it in terms that would have embarrassed Edward if he were the kind of man who read reviews, which he was not. Fiona read them. Fiona read them all. She read them aloud to the roses, which was the only context in which she still talked to them regularly, because the roses, she felt, deserved to know they were famous. The third certainty was Fiona herself. She had not changed. That was the wrong word. She had not changed the way that water does not change when it moves from ice to liquid. She was still the same substance, still stubborn, still fierce, still capable of reducing a hydrangea to silence with nothing but volume and intent. But she had thawed. The stone in her pocket, the one she carried for Callum, was still there. She could still feel it when she reached for it, but it was smaller now, smoother, worn down by time and by the slow, patient work of living, which is the only thing that makes grief manageable. Not smaller, not gone, but manageable. The way a stone in a pocket is manageable when your other pocket has something warm in it. Edward proposed on a Tuesday. Not because Tuesday was significant, because he had woken up on Tuesday morning and looked at the ceiling of the cottage and felt, with the sudden, irrefutable clarity of a man who had been thinking about something for 2 years and had just realized he already knew the answer, that he wanted to marry Fiona Lennox, and that waiting until a more appropriate day was the kind of cowardice that he had been curing himself of since the moment he circled a newspaper ad in blue ink and knocked on a stranger's door. He did not have a ring. He did not have a plan. He did not have flowers or champagne or a speech rehearsed in the bathroom mirror. He had a pair of muddy boots and a cup of tea, and the specific, irreducible knowledge that this woman, this infuriating, magnificent, toast-burning woman, was the person he wanted to stand next to for the rest of his life, and that standing next to her in a garden was exactly as good as standing next to her in a cathedral, and that the difference between a duke proposing and a gardener proposing was nothing, nothing at all, because love does not check your title before it lets you in. He found her in the kitchen. She was making porridge. Mary was at school. Helen was upstairs. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet in the middle of a busy day. A temporary quiet, a breath between actions. "Fiona," he said. She turned from the stove. She had a wooden spoon in one hand, and a tea towel over her shoulder, and a smear of porridge on her wrist. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, with the combination of warmth and wariness that was her default expression around him, the expression of a woman who had learned that the people she loved had a habit of leaving, and who was always, somewhere in the back of her mind, braced for it. "What?" she said. "Marry me." The words landed in the kitchen like a bird landing on a branch. Light, simple, unexpected in the way that simple things are unexpected when they arrive without preamble. Fiona looked at him. She looked at the spoon in her hand. She looked at the porridge, which was beginning to stick to the bottom of the pot. She looked at the crack in the plaster above the stove, which she had never fixed, and never intended to fix, because the crack was part of the house now, part of its character, part of its story. "The porridge is burning," she said. "I do not care about the porridge. I care about the porridge. The porridge is my responsibility. You are proposing to me while my porridge is burning, which is either the most romantic thing that has ever happened in this kitchen, or the most inconsiderate, and I cannot decide which because I am holding a spoon, and my porridge is burning." She turned off the stove. She set down the spoon. She turned back to him. "Yes," she said. "Yes? Yes, I will marry you, on the condition that you never propose to me again while I am cooking, because cooking is a sacred act, and should not be interrupted by emotional ambushes, even welcome ones." Edward crossed the kitchen. He put his hands on her face. She put her hands on his wrists. They stood in the kitchen with the burned porridge, and the cracked plaster, and the tea towel, and the wooden spoon, and they looked at each other, and the looking was enough. He kissed her. She kissed him back. It was not careful this time. It was not hesitant. It was the kiss of two people who had run out of reasons to be careful, and had discovered that recklessness, when applied to the right person, was not recklessness at all. It was faith. Helen walked in, saw them, walked out, made a phone call to her husband that consisted of 4 words. It finally happened. Her husband, who had been hearing about the gardener and the innkeeper for 2 years, said, "About bloody time." Myrie was told after school. She received the news with the unsurprised satisfaction of a person whose long-term predictions had been vindicated. "I knew it," she said. "I have known since the birdhouse." "The birdhouse was over a year ago," Fiona said. "Yes, you two are very slow." "We are not slow. We are cautious. Cautious is just slow with an excuse." Fiona looked at her daughter. Her daughter looked back. The gap-toothed grin was gone, replaced by a full set of teeth, and an expression that was equal parts triumph and tenderness. "Are you happy?" Fiona asked. "I am so happy that I am going to need a bigger piece of paper." She ran to get her drawing supplies. 20 minutes later, a new picture went on the fridge. 3 stick figures in a garden. 1 small with red hair, 1 tall with dark hair and gray eyes, 1 medium height with brown hair, and a spoon. The wedding was in June. Edward reclaimed his title in April, through a meeting with Philip Hartwell, and a series of documents that transferred estate management to a trust, ensuring that Lynmore Hall would be maintained and operated, without requiring Edward to live there. The trust would employ a director, maintain the grounds, open the house to the public on selected days, and preserve the estate for future generations. Future generations being a phrase that both Edward and Philip understood to mean Myrie, who was not Edward's daughter by blood, but who was, in every way that mattered, his daughter by choice. The legalities took 3 weeks. The emotions took longer. Edward visited Lynmore alone, before the wedding. He drove south for the first time in 2 years, through the Highlands and the Lowlands, and across the border into England, through Northumberland, through the gates of the estate, up the drive lined with oaks his great-grandfather had planted, to the front steps, where his father had died, and where he had stood in mourning dress, on investiture day, with Catherine beside him, smiling, alive, the wind catching her hair. The house was as he had left it, the staff had maintained it, the gardens were tended, though not with the attention he would have given them. The peonies on the south terrace were overgrown, Catherine's peonies. He stood among them for a long time. He did not feel grief. He felt something else. Something that had replaced grief the way spring replaces winter, not by erasing it, but by growing over it, through it, around it, until the grief was still there but the growth was there too, and the growth was stronger. He walked through the house, the portraits, the library, the gallery, the bedroom he had shared with Catherine, unchanged, the curtains drawn, the air still. He opened the curtains, he opened the windows, he let the air in. He stood at the window and looked out over 9,000 acres of land that bore his name, and felt, for the first time, that the land was not a burden. It was a responsibility, and responsibility was something he understood now in a way he had not understood before, because Fiona had taught him, without trying to teach him, that responsibility was not the same as sacrifice. Responsibility was showing up. Responsibility was rebuilding walls. Responsibility was leaving plates on steps and burning toast and talking to roses and raising a child alone in a groaning house and never, not once, giving up. He closed the windows. He locked the house. He drove back to Scotland. The wedding was at Briarstone. Not at a church. Not at Lynmore. At Briarstone, in the garden, on a Tuesday in June, because Tuesdays were their day. The day he had proposed. The day the porridge burned. The day everything that mattered had begun. Fiona wore a white dress that she had bought in Inverness with her mother, who had cried in the fitting room and then denied it, blaming allergies, which Margaret did not have. Edward wore a dark suit that was not his investiture suit, that was not his funeral suit, that was a new suit bought for a new occasion, because new occasions deserved new clothes. Mary wore a green dress the color of the garden in summer. She held a fistful of flowers she had picked herself, and the flowers were, roughly, half proper flowers and half weeds, because Myrie did not believe in the distinction between the two, and nobody was going to argue with her on her mother's wedding day. The guests were village locals, Helen and her husband, Colin and his girlfriend, Nora, Constable McPhee, out of uniform, looking uncomfortable in a tie, Leonard Finch the professor, who had returned for the occasion, and who gave a toast that referenced Robert the Bruce, the spider, and the persistence of hope, and that made everyone cry except Mary, who was too busy feeding cake to the cat. Margaret Lennox sat in the front row and cried without apologizing for it. Lady Constance Ashworth sat beside her, and the two women, who had met for the first time the previous evening, and who had nothing in common except the fact that their children had found each other in the wreckage of loss, held hands through the ceremony and did not let go. Simon Fletcher sent a card. It had a golden eagle on the front. The ceremony was short. The vows were simple. Edward said he would love Fiona for the rest of his life, which was a promise he had been keeping since the morning she threatened a hydrangea with eviction. Fiona said she would love Edward for the rest of her life, which was a promise she had been keeping since the night he climbed her roof in a storm. They kissed in the garden he had built, surrounded by the walls he had rebuilt, beneath the apple tree where the birdhouse hung, next to the roses that had heard every secret and every fear and every hope that Fiona had spoken aloud over 2 years of talking to plants, because talking to plants was easier than admitting she needed a person. She had the person now. After the ceremony, after the toasts and the cake and the photographs and the dancing, which happened in the sitting room, to music played on a speaker that Colin had set up, and that worked perfectly, because Colin's electronics never failed. Fiona stood in the kitchen alone for a moment. She looked at the crack in the plaster. She looked at the counter where she made tea, the stove where she burned toast, the windowsill where clean plates used to appear, the table where she had sat with the electricity bill and the roof quote and the booking calendar, and the weight of everything she carried. She looked at the jar on the table, which no longer held wilting chrysanthemums. It held sweet peas, pink ones, fresh from the south wall, fresh from the garden, fresh from the life she had built from the ruins of the one she lost. She did not talk to the roses. She went outside. She stood in her garden. She looked at the greenhouse and the walls and the paths and the beds and the birdhouse in the apple tree and the sweet peas on the south wall, and she breathed, and the air smelled like peat and grass and roses and summer and something else, something that did not have a name but that she recognized, the way you recognize a song from 2 notes. It was the smell of a garden that someone loved. Edward found her there. He stood beside her. They looked at the garden together, The garden that had been a ruin and was now a living thing, full of color and growth and the accumulated work of two people who had each come to this place broken and had rebuilt, stone by stone, not just the walls and the beds and the greenhouse, but themselves. "Mary has eaten 4 pieces of cake," Edward said. "I know. I am choosing not to intervene. She will be ill. She will be ill and happy outweighs ill." He took her hand. She leaned into him. The evening light turned the garden gold. "Thank you," he said. "For what? For not asking questions. For the plates on the step. For the tea on the wall. For the sandwiches in the doorway. For letting me fix your walls when I could not fix my own." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you for the greenhouse, and the sweet peas, and the birdhouse, and climbing my roof in a storm, and lying to me about everything, which I have forgiven, but will bring up at least once a year for the rest of our lives. I would expect nothing less." They stood in the garden. The light faded. The music played inside. Mary's laughter carried through the open kitchen door, loud and bright and full of cake and joy, and the absolute certainty that the world was a good place, because the world, as seen from the garden of Briarstone House, on a Tuesday in June, with a mother who talked to roses, and a gardener who was secretly a duke, and a birdhouse full of blue tits, was, in fact, good. The tabloid ran a follow-up story the next week. The headline was, "Duke Trades Manor for Mud." It was the same headline they had used before, because tabloids are not known for their creativity. Fiona framed it. She hung it next to the first one. She now had a small gallery of tabloid headlines in her hallway, which she referred to as the Wall of Shame, and which guests found either charming or baffling, depending on whether they read tabloids. Briarstone House continued to thrive. The garden continued to grow. The roses continued to bloom. The blue tits returned every spring, and Myrie continued to name every one, and the names grew more elaborate each year, progressing from simple things like Pip and Dot to complex titles like Sir Reginald Fluffington III, which was, as Edward pointed out, ironically aristocratic for a bird living in a house that had been built as a rebellion against aristocracy. The sweet peas bloomed pink, every year, every single year. Myrie remained insufferable about it. Years passed. Briarstone expanded. A second building was added, converted from an old barn on the property, doubling the capacity. The garden grew with it, extending beyond the original walls into what had been moorland, new paths, new beds, new plantings, each one Edward's design, each one a conversation between what the land wanted and what the gardener could offer. The greenhouse became a teaching space, where Edward ran weekend workshops on horticulture that attracted people from all over Scotland and occasionally from England, people who came to learn about soil and seasons and left knowing something about patience and loss and the stubbornness of green things. Myrie grew up. She went to school. She studied. She left for university, which was the hardest thing Fiona had done since burying Callum, letting go of the person she held tightest. Myrie studied botany, which surprised no one. She came home every holiday and walked the garden with Edward and argued about pruning techniques and planting schedules and whether sweet peas could truly be pink through optimism. And the arguments were the kind that happen between people who love the same thing and disagree about the details, which is the best kind of argument and the kind that never truly ends. Edward's mother visited twice a year. She and Margaret became friends, a friendship built on grandchild worship and wine, and the shared conviction that their children were, while wonderful, also exasperatingly slow in all emotional matters. Fiona stopped burning toast. Not intentionally, not through effort or practice or any conscious change. She simply stopped. One morning, the toast came out golden. The next morning, golden again. And the morning after that. She stood at the toaster and looked at the perfectly browned slices and felt a small, strange sadness, as if the burning had been a companion, a familiar, a daily reminder that some part of her was always elsewhere, always distracted, always carrying something that took her attention away from the present. And now the present had her full attention, and the toast knew it. She told Edward. He laughed. Not the ghost, not the almost, the real thing, the one that changed his face and made her chest do the thing that she had stopped trying to resist years ago. "You could burn it on purpose," he said. "It would not be the same. No, it would not. They sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen, the same crack in the plaster above the stove, the same window that looked out over the same garden, which was not the same garden at all, which was a garden that had been loved, and tended, and argued over, and cried in, and proposed in, and married in, a garden that held all of them, all their grief, and all their joy, and all the spaces in between. Fiona looked at the crack. She had never fixed it. She never would. The crack was part of the house, part of the story. She drank her tea. Edward drank his. The morning light came through the window and landed on the table between them, warm and gold and ordinary. And the ordinariness of it was the most extraordinary thing, because ordinary is what happens when you survive long enough for the extraordinary to become daily, for the miracle to become routine, for the person who saved you to become the person who sits across from you at breakfast and drinks tea, and reads the paper, and asks if you want more toast. More toast? Edward asked. Please. He made it. It came out golden. They ate it together, in the kitchen of the house that groaned, in the garden that grew, in the life that they had built, stone by stone, plate by plate, season by season, from the ruins of two others. He had not come to Scotland to find her. He had come to disappear. But some people do not let you disappear. They leave plates on your step and talk to their roses, and wait, with the stubborn patience of a garden in winter, for you to remember that you are still alive. Fiona had waited. Edward had remembered. And the garden grew.